Okay, good morning and welcome to the 37th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 6, 7, 8 and 9 in private. Item 6 is consideration of today's evidence on the Ecocide Scotland Bill. Item 7 is the consideration of the evidence on the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Bill LCM. Item 8 is our work programme and item 9 relates to the contract of our advisor on climate change. Are we agreed to take all these items in private? We are agreed. Our second item of business is the consideration of a draft statutory instrument, the Companies Act 2006, Scottish Public Sector Companies to be audited by the Auditor General for Scotland, Order 2026. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee have made no comment on the instrument in their report, and I welcome to the meeting Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Transport, and her supporting officials, Ninian Christie, lawyer for the Scottish Government, Lee Shedden, for the Head of Rail Sponsorship and Regulation for Transport Scotland. The instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means it cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves it. Following the evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider a motion to recommend the instrument be approved. And I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. Cabinet Secretary, I think you want to make a brief opening statement.
Yes, good morning, Convener Committee members. Thank you for inviting me to attend committee to discuss the draft SSI. Scottish Rail Holdings Limited oversees the delivery of rail passenger services by its wholly owned subsidiaries ScotRail Trains Limited and Caledonian Sleeper Limited on behalf of the Scottish Ministers. Scottish Ministers are the sole shareholder of Scottish Rail Holdings Limited, company established under the Companies Act and classified by ONS as a central government body. In June 2022, an order was made under Section 483 of the Companies Act 2006 requiring Scottish Rail Holdings accounts to be audited by the Auditor General for Scotland, which engages the relevant provisions of Part 2 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. And although ScotRail Trains Limited is a subsidiary company and therefore part of Scottish Rail Holdings Group in terms of Section 479A of the Companies Act 2006, the audit did not extend the requirement for Auditor General to audit their individual accounts. This was due to a lack of capacity for the Auditor General to resource these audits at the time, which has subsequently been addressed. I now seek the support of the committee to progress this order to enable the accounts for ScotRail Trains and Caledonian Sleeper to be audited by the Auditor General for Scotland. Currently, the audits for both subsidiaries are being undertaken by an external auditor at a significant cost, and this order will enable more efficient and effective audits to be undertaken at less cost to the taxpayer. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions members may have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I understand the reasons why you've given. Could you just tell me how much we were paying, or the people of Scotland were paying for the previous audit? So
on the basis that this was not being done by the Auditor General and due to the lack of capacity of the Auditor General, that was outsourced, and in 2023-24 that was a total of £515,000, and in 2024-25 it was £490,000, but we understand that with the Auditor General conducting the audit, that should be better for the taxpayer.
Okay, it's a huge amount of money, £515,000 for that business. So, as you're saving money there, I assume if it's going to be carried out by the Auditor General, there will be some cost to the Auditor General for doing this. Are you making additional funds available from the money you're saving, or are you just expecting the Auditor General to do it for free?
No, we will be ensuring the Auditor General is recompensed for the duties they are carrying out on behalf of the public.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
We will ensure the Auditor General is recompensed for the duties they are carrying out on behalf of the public.
So how much is that, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, they haven't done it yet, but do you want to...
There should be a significant saving from the costs of the external, but we don't know the amount yet. The Auditor General has yet to advise, but should be a significant cost reduction.
It's a good thing.
I'm sorry, I'm just scratching my head that he's agreeing to take it on without any indication of what additional resources will be given to him. That, if I know the Auditor General, he wouldn't do that. He's quite a sharp cookie when it comes to that, and will have worked out what the implications are, surely, Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I'm sure they have, yes. But I can't, it's not for me to speak on behalf of the Auditor-General, but this is something that has been agreed, and it will...
Well, it's been agreed, then you know how much. How much is it?
Well, we're expecting it to be reduced to about 300,000 to 350,000, and it's a wider scope, because obviously there's public finances involved as well, which obviously the Auditor-General has expertise in.
So you're saving about 165,000? Yeah?
Yes.
OK. Sorry, Douglas.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just one question, and that's, you know, this can happen because the company receives all or most of its funding from a public body already audited by the Auditor-General for Scotland. So what percentage of funding is it that they get from the public? And I guess what happens if that funding goes down because maybe more income is taken from passengers instead, or am I getting it completely wrong, Cabinet Secretary?
Not quite sure. I mean, in terms of the amount of funding between Caledonia Sleeper and Scotland, I mean, that's about over £800 million. It's a significant amount of funding. In terms of, their duties and responsibilities of auditor, I'm not an accountant, but in terms of auditing, and I've not exercised audit functions myself. So therefore, in terms of what they have to audit, it would be the same functions regardless of whether the income fare level had gone up or otherwise, because what it is, it's the function and of what they're looking at in terms of accounts that they're looking at, as opposed to the absolute amounts in terms of fares or otherwise, if I am understanding your question.
Well, it's more because I'm looking at the Companies Act 2006, says, all or most of its funding from a public body. So obviously you've explained it's 800 million or something.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that there are a few lines that, in terms of profit levels, can bring in very good income levels, not least the Glasgow-Edinburgh line, the vast majority of our rail services, and if you particularly look at what we're commissioning, I suppose it's separate in terms of Network Rail commissioning, but it's a substantial amount of money, and so the subsidy levels that go into rail, not just in our country, but across the UK and elsewhere, is substantial.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out whether that's where they get most of the funding from.
No.
So then, but according to the Act, it's all or most of its funding from...
Yeah, because the Scottish Government provides most of the funding, because it's subsidised.
So it's not most of their funding overall? Or is that correct?
Convener, can you help me with where this might be going? I'm not really sure.
I'm just trying to make sure that what we're approving today is actually legal.
Do you want to come in and explain the overall funding? But the overall funding, the vast majority of funding is public, right? Which is why they're obviously being audited the way they have. And obviously there's Company Acts scrutiny, but also because of the, as you pointed out, the public funding nature of this, the relevant provisions of Part 2 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000 also come into play because it's publicly funded. But Leo, can you maybe help me?
Yes, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, you're right. Most of the funding is provided by the Scottish Government. Okay. In terms of the normal operating costs, it's just over 50%. But on top of that, we also provide funding for the fixed track access charges, which ScotRail then pays over to Network Rail, which is an additional about £350 million. So that takes the balance way over. But it's really just a wash through because of the kind of subsidy of Network Rail.
So there's not really a danger of it not being the most funding, and then we have to undo this. That's what I'm trying to understand.
I can't see a scenario where that would happen, although reforms to rail are currently underway, and the funding mechanism may change how that's paid.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Just looking around, are there any other companies, Cabinet Secretary, that are also in the same position as ScotRail that are privately audited?
In terms of, I'm just trying to, I'd prefer to just come back to you on that, because it's obviously not...
I mean, does CalMat fall into that position?
Well, they would have their own, but they would, but obviously we've just moved into a direct award aspect, so that's contractual, but they will exist as a public... They will exist as an entity that needs to have their own audited accounts, but part of that, in terms of our provision, I'd rather come back to you in terms of the technical...
Yeah, I'm just thinking that most, if not all, of their money comes from the government, doesn't it? It comes from contracts. It's a CalMac does get all its money from us, doesn't it?
In terms of, again, our transport system is heavily invested and subsidised by the Scottish Government.
I'm just looking for other opportunities where we can save money, Cabinet Secretary, because I don't know what their accounts cost to audit. Perhaps Lee knows. I don't know.
It's not my area anymore, but I think they are significant because it's a big industry like ScotRail.
Well, maybe the Cabinet Secretary could come back after this meeting and let us know.
Yeah, happy to do so. Happy to do so.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you. We'll now move on to agenda item 3, which is a debate on motion S6M 20027, calling on the committee to recommend the Companies Act 2006 Scottish Public Sector Companies to be audited by the Auditor General for Scotland Order 2026 be approved. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion.
I'm happy just to move the motion, Convener.
Thank you. I think most of the points that I'd raised certainly were in the previous thing about the savings that would be accrued and what the costs would be to the Auditor General, and just my slight wariness to make sure that the Auditor General has sufficient funds and resources to cover the additional work. But it sounds like he's already negotiated those with you, Cabinet Secretary. Does anyone else have any points they wish to raise? So, Cabinet Secretary, on that basis, do you want to sum up? Is there anything you want to sum up on?
Nothing to sum up. I'm happy to take the guidance of the committee on this.
Okay, so thank you. The question is that motion S6M 20027 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The committee will report on the outcome of this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Is the committee happy to do that? Yes, thank you. Right, I think I'm just going to suspend the meeting briefly to allow a changeover of officials. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Okay, welcome back to the meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Our fourth item of business is consideration of the legislative consent memorandum on the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions Bill. The bill was introduced to the House of Commons on the 10th of September, and the Scottish Government lodged the LCM on the 25th of September. The bill will enable the UK to implement the BBNJ agreement, which seeks to ensure the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdictions. We have a very tight timescale for this LCM, and we're told that the bill must be enforced by January in order for the UK to meet new treaty obligations. This effectively means the committee must agree a report next week. We therefore have had little choice but to agree to have this evidence session this week, even though we're still waiting for a supplementary LCM to be lodged. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary, Gillian Martin, to the meeting and her supporting officials. We've got Aileen MacDonald, the Head of Marine and Climate Biodiversity, and Dr Joanna Dingwall, Branch Head Lawyer for the Scottish Government. Before moving into questions, I believe, Cabinet Secretary, you wish to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the Biodiversity Beyond Natural Jurisdiction Bill and legislative consent in relation to it. As you've just said, it implements the BBNJ agreement, significant United Nations landmark agreement to protect biodiversity. We support the aims. We're keen to ensure that, with the consent of the Parliament, the UK can ratify the agreement in time for it to take place at the first Conference of Parties. But our support for the UK bill as introduced is unfortunately not straightforward due to two significant challenges. Firstly, it spans a complex mix of devolved and reserved competencies covering a wide range of policy areas, and this was not reflected in the initial drafting of the bill. Secondly, the timeline has from the off been incredibly difficult. We're not afforded sufficient time prior to the introduction to engage with the devolved aspects, and this meant that while we managed to secure rapid amendment to certain clauses for introduction, the remainder have had to be analysed and negotiated in parallel to the bill's passage, and consequently I lodged that initial LCM for some clauses but reserved position for the rest. And I have to put on record my deep disappointment and frustration that the timeline is so tight. I've not been able to provide a full LCM to the committee and give Scottish parliamentary scrutiny process and our democratic devolved legislative process. I don't believe it should be rushed, and I've highlighted my concerns on this to the UK Government. I had a meeting last week with the lead UK Minister, Seema Malhotra, and of course prior to that I had written all our concerns in the letter. So I can speak to the initial LCM lodged, amendments for clause 18 tabled in the House of Lords yesterday, and where we're still engaged in intensive ongoing negotiation, and can speak to a general approach to robustly protecting devolution despite the challenges that the timeline presents. And I also want to say that the negotiations are still ongoing, and we want to keep the committee informed as quickly as possible about the outcome of those negotiations, and you have my word that we'll do that.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. It's probably fair to say the committee has found itself in a position with LCMs of having to agree things or not agree things because we haven't had time to take evidence. And the committee has written now twice to the UK Parliament. We wrote to the Speaker merely, I think, 3 weeks ago, suggesting that to respect the devolution, that we ought to be given more time so that the Parliament in Scotland is considered not just a rubber stamp for events, but actually take part in it. And I think genuinely there are a lot of reasons why I find this uncomfortable, as I've done other bills, because I think that to sideline the Scottish Parliament when we're sitting here trying to do a job is disrespectful. And I'm glad I've got that off my chest and on the record, as it were. So my question is, where high seas activities intersect and devolve with devolved competencies, can you give me some practical examples where there's going to be if there's going to be friction, or where it's going to work in conjunction with the Scottish Government?
Well, the sort of activities that we see it impacting, or the activities would usually be in the sort of marine protection, marine research, including sea fisheries management, marine licensing, and the implementation of international agreements as regards Scotland. I don't see necessarily things. I can't foresee what might come into conflict, but I think it comes back to effectively what you've just said, Convener, is that there's issues of devolved competence for which at the moment in the bill the Secretary of State for Scotland would have he'd be the sole actor in that, and that would go over Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament, and not be able to scrutinise the Secretary of State for Scotland on the decisions made in those areas. So it's a fundamental issue that we have seen with other LCMs in the past. Believe me, I share your frustration about the timeline. Completely, we've not been able to do our analysis as fast as we can. We need to be sure what it is that we're signing up to. And of course, everyone in this place will know that we have to make sure that the Seoul Convention is adhered to. So I can't give a list as such of all the potential issues. I think you used the word conflicts that might arise, because I can't foresee what kind of issues would arise. But it's the fundamental point is that we can't have a situation where it's in devolved competence and we have a UK minister making all the decisions. without the consent of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government.
I mean, it's quite difficult for this committee, Cabinet Secretary, to consider this because we don't fully understand the implications of what we're doing because we don't have the final LCM in front of us, which causes me concern. I'll just push slightly. Is the Scottish Government seeking concurrent powers with the UK concurrent powers to those being granted to the Secretary of State in relation to implementing the obligations? So are you looking for the same powers in Scotland, or are you just going to be in a position where you're going to give those over to the Secretary of State?
So we're exploring all options. I won't alight on one particular. There's a range of options that we're exploring with my officials have been working very, very hard to try and get an agreement that we could be satisfied with. Obviously, concurrent powers is an option in there as well. We're effectively, if I could put it this way, we're looking at any potential protections to ensure that devolution is properly respected in the bill.
So, Cabinet Secretary, I understand that, and I'm sure you're doing that, and I have confidence you're doing it. Try and give me an example, please, so I can understand it. You know, where are the areas where you're happy to give over power to the Secretary of State, and where are the areas that you're not happy to give power over to the Secretary of State?
I have to really be very careful about what I say in terms of we are negotiating at the moment, and I don't think that, well, the committee might want the detail of what we're negotiating on. But concurrent powers is one, of course, but that's one area that we're looking at with them. If I were to tell you all the areas in which we would be a compromise area, whatever, what we want is consent powers. We want consent for the Scottish ministers and indeed the Scottish Parliament. That is the bedrock of Sewell, and that's the bedrock of devolution. So if I were
but Cabinet Secretary, come on, I'm trying to understand. You're bringing this to the committee, and I'm trying to understand how the committee, or me as a committee member, can say, look, I agree to this LCM when you're not telling me anything about it. I'm as much in the dark as I was at 5 o'clock this morning when I was rereading the papers.
We're negotiating sufficient protections. There is a number of protections that are on the table that's in discussion between myself and the UK Government Minister right now. Now, I did say that I would try my best to let the committee know the outcome of those negotiations, in which you will have notice of what we've actually agreed to. But while those negotiations are ongoing, forgive me if I don't run down a list of potential protections that we either would or would not seek to have in the bill, because they're still being negotiated. I hope you will respect that.
I find it impossible to do my job if as a member of this Parliament, if I don't know that. And I think we're in the position where the House of Lords Committee is sitting on the 16th of, 16th of December, and we've got to report by the 4th of January. So you've promised to keep us updated. I look forward to that. Maybe it'll be under the Christmas tree, because, I mean, effectively, we're not going to get this before next week, and we're going to be in recess up until the 4th of January. I'm struggling, but
I understand that, convener, but one thing, you say it's difficult for you to do your job, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't make sure that we protect devolution and absolutely everything that comes over my desk from the UK Government.
I absolutely concur with that, but we are an arm of this Parliament as a committee, and we have a job to scrutinise things that are put before us. It's difficult to do it if we don't. I'm going to move to the Deputy Convener, I think, who has the next questions. Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. Parts 2 and 3 of the bill provide regulation-making powers to UK Government ministers. What's the Scottish Government's position on these powers?
So at the moment we can't agree to Part 2 as the schedule imposes obligations relating to collection and utilisation of MGR and associated DSI from ABNG. That includes requirements for notification.
Sorry, can you decipher that for me, please?
So these clauses in Part 2, Clause 2 to 10, impose obligations relating to the collection and utilisation of marine genetic resources. And sorry for me doing what I always said I wouldn't do, and that's mention acronyms. I like to usually give the full name. So these clauses impact on devolved matters through the level of impact for the provisions on Scottish actors We do think that will be limited, but the bill provides an exemption of the provisions for fishing and fishing-related activities. So only a small number of organisations are currently involved in collecting and utilising these marine genetic resources. But I have to say that Part 2 raises questions about the impacts on devolved matters and the role of devolved institutions, and the clauses are still, as I say, they're still subject to that ongoing negotiation with the UK Government to bottom that out. As we explore the protections with the UK Government, we need to make sure that, first of all, we have consent associated with any devolved areas, and we're hopeful that we can conclude the negotiations. But that's effectively a summary of what's in Part 2 and why it's important that we have consent.
So just so I understand this clearly, so the Scottish Government is opposed to all of Part 2?
Clauses 2 to 10 are the ones where we have issues.
In Part 2?
In Part 2.
Yeah, and Part 3?
Yeah,
yeah. I'm just double checking that I've got that right. Part 2,
that's right.
2 to 10.
Provided no position in the initial LCM for all of Part 2, and Cabinet Secretary's just set out that particularly Clause 9, where the Secretary of State has sole power to legislate in potentially devolved areas, is one particular area of concern that's been raised through letters from this committee and from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee as well. And Part 3, area-based management tools, is also an area where there was no position taken in the initial LCM, and another area subject to ongoing negotiations.
Okay, so you've stated that your position is that you're opposed to the existing provisions in Part 2 on the regulation-making powers, subject to negotiations.
Yes, subject to negotiations. And as it stands, we can't support them, and we need to make sure that these negotiations have mechanisms in there that give oversight by the Scottish Parliament and indeed respect devolved competence.
Okay, so that's clear from me in Part 2. In Part 3, clauses 11 and 13, you're opposed to that, subject to negotiation?
Subject to negotiation.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
You're opposed to it as it stands at the moment?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Michael, the next questions come from Mark.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about area-based management tools and how you would anticipate this legislation working in a devolved context? What is the potential fix or amendment or negotiated outcome that you're looking for in relation to these tools? I'm just trying to picture in practice what this actually means.
If I at the moment, if I talk about Clause 9, provides a power for the Secretary of State to make regulations in relation to the genetic recovery. Yes, thank you. Including benefit sharing, enforcement, conflict avoidance. And this may apply to devolved matters. There's currently no requirement to secure the consent of Scottish ministers for the Secretary of State to act in those areas which are in devolved competence. So the fix is to put consent, that the Secretary of State would seek the consent of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament.
Okay.
And I had a meeting with the Minister to outline why that is so important. Now, will it impact on a lot of activities? No, but it is the fundamental bedrock of making sure that we have a UK government that does not act in a way that overrides devolved competence. So that's what we're seeking.
Right.
My Scottish Government legal colleague is asked to come in.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question about area-based management tools. So particularly we're focused on Clause 11 in that regard. So with the area-based management tools, at the moment the BBNJ agreement, it's essentially a framework agreement putting in place processes for eventual adoption of area-based management tools. So right now we don't per se know exactly what they will be. We could anticipate marine protected areas. There might be other types of controls on marine activities that effectively become an area-based management tool. And so for us, a main focus is Clause 11, because it's in Clause 11 that the Secretary of State would be implementing the area-based management tools through regulation. And the particular concern for the Scottish Government is to make sure that for any area-based management tools that impact upon Scottish actors, Scottish ministers have an appropriate role, an oversight role, and input. So that is effectively our main focus. And so that could take the form of consent, or as Cabinet Secretary has explained, it could be concurrent powers or some other form. So we're considering all options, and that's the subject of ongoing negotiations just now.
13's also been negotiated as well, which is in the area of emergency directions. And that's probably an area of negotiation which is more straightforward. But 11's the one where 11 and 13 need to be bottomed out, because obviously we need to be making sure that even in emergency situations that we have an awareness of what's happening, and we're involved in what the actions that the Secretary of State is taking. Okay.
So I think I understand that. I mean, we're talking about the area that's beyond 200 nautical miles. So is there much of the Scottish fleet that is really operating beyond 200 nautical miles? Are we looking mostly at pelagic sector, or?
Well, there's two elements to this, because on the one hand, it could be activities out in the area beyond national jurisdiction, beyond 200 nautical miles, which could be, in some respects, the BBNJ agreement is trying to create a regime for the future, because there are increasing different types of activities out there. So as Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned, we're not, at the moment, there aren't a huge amount of Scottish activities, but it's really a growth industry. And the other thing I would just flag up is that Scotland is in a unique position in that we are the part of the UK that has an area of extended continental shelf, which goes beyond 200 nautical miles because of the prolongation of our continental shelf in Scotland. So the UK has claimed that. And in respect of this area, under the BBNJ agreement, there could be area-based management tools, protections put in place for this area, where Scottish ministers currently have executive functions in relation to the seabed and subsoil. So these would be area-based management tools that relate to the water column beyond 200 nautical miles, but within our extended continental shelf. So we do have a particular interest as well in respect of our executive powers there.
No, I can see that in terms of that kind of ecological coherence with the continental shelf and how it extends beyond that. So thanks, that's a good example. Can I also ask then about, you mentioned about the kind of notification, storage, access, reporting around marine genetic resources, as well as the kind of coordination around potential area-based management tools. So how would you anticipate that being organised? I mean, who would lead on that? Would there be UK government that would lead on it, but the Scottish government would want to feed in?
Yeah.
Again, I'm just trying to picture what this activity
so obviously,
is, and what reality is Scottish government's function within that.
So in reality, most of the actions associated with the BBNJ bill will be exercised by UK government ministers. We don't have any problem with that. It's just a case of having our consent to do so. Obviously, I mean, particularly in emergency situations, and there's going to be conflict between marine craft or whatever, obviously the UK government have got responsibility for that. It's the consent of Scottish ministers that is the issue here, not the deployment or the response.
Okay, so some of these functions could be coordinated on a UK level, but the Scottish Government would be seeking to input into that process rather than leading on
awareness
it itself.
and consent.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I think that's clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I've got Douglas next, and then I'll come to you, Bob, if that's all right.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I was just want to continue on the theme of the area-based management tools, just to try and get a better understanding. So, is it possible then that the UK government could really bring forward another highly protected, marine areas by the back door almost, or can they make changes then to actually toughen up the rules about where a fisherman can fish.
I suppose that there are provisions on area-based management tools like MPAs would be a component of this, and that's why it's so important that we have consent around this. As far as HPMAs are concerned, I don't know if I can answer that question, but effectively in terms of like fisheries management tools, as Douglas Lumsden has pointed out, is the domain of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to scrutinise what was happening in that area. I suppose in a kind of scenario, a potential scenario, whether that's likely to happen, I don't think so, but it's effectively that's marine protection is a power that it sits with the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. So we wouldn't want to see a UK government minister having any powers over marine protection, which... Well, yeah.
It might be helpful just to give a bit of context to what these decisions would be and the status of them. So they would be decisions taken at the Conference of Parties, which is the international decision-making body, meeting for the first time, we expect, next summer. So there would be a period leading up to those meetings of the Conference of the Parties. We would expect to be involved as part of the Memorandum of Understanding between the UK Government and the devolved administrations, the Concordat on International Relations, in the lead-up to the UK taking its seat at a Conference of Parties. Those decisions would be made on what's necessary to protect biodiversity in the high seas there, together, and then this is the bit, Clause 11 would be, and 13, in emergency situations, would be implementing those decisions and the power to make legislation to do that. So it's not so much that the UK government would have a policy of its own to introduce something. This is a decision that would be taken with the Scottish Government involved in the lead-up, and then it would be taken together by the signatories to the agreement.
So it's not a case where the UK Government can then actually change, by regulation, where fishermen can fish. That would be an agreement between...
But they could sign up to something that's decided on in the Conference of Parties. So obviously Scotland doesn't have a seat because we're not a nation state at the Conference of Parties. So we'd be reliant on the UK Government to be negotiating the situation on our behalf. So we're obviously looking for mechanisms within this bill to make sure that the Scottish Government are consulted and included in those discussions at the Conference of Parties. But when an agreement is made by the Conference of Parties, that we need to have consent over the devolved parts of that, because we can't have implementation of things that we haven't signed up to. It's as simple as that, I suppose.
So can I ask, in terms of consultation with and engagement with the fishing industry, have they had input into this? Do they have concerns that they've raised about this legislation?
Well, I think that's more of a discussion to be had with the UK Government, but certainly the Scottish institutions are included in the explanatory notes for the BBNJ bill. And obviously, as the guidance is developed afterwards, we want to be ensuring that the Scottish Government has engagement with all stakeholders that might be affected by this. There's been a consultation, a public consultation that the UK Government, I think I'm just looking here, 21st of November, implement a consultation relating to the implementation of Part 4 of the BBNJ agreement, which is related to marine licensable activities. That closes on the 19th of December. And we were involved in what that looked like, a joint consultation. So obviously, if anybody's watching this and concerned about any issues around marine licensable activities, they have until the 19th of December to put their points. But obviously, once this bill is enacted and we have a better understanding of where we've got to in terms of consent, then we obviously would want to make sure that all our Scottish stakeholders have the opportunity to be involved in the guidance that we put together.
Yeah, because that is my concern just now, Convener, is that we're being asked to, well, the Parliament will be asked to approve this, but I don't understand the implication to the Scottish fishermen. So.
There is another aspect to this as well, and that is actually ascertaining all the breadth of activities that might happen in this area. The consultation will also give both governments an understanding of what is actually taking place beyond natural jurisdictions. Obviously, I've given the convener a few instances of things we know in terms of like marine research and whatever. But through the consultation, we'll have to have a better understanding of who is carrying out what, and what those activities are, and what is the connection to both the UK and Scotland.
Okay, thanks, convener.
Bob, you wanted to ask a question?
I'm going to violently try to understand this, convener. Cabinet Secretary, can I check, as things currently stand, what regulatory or legislative powers does the Scottish Government have in relation to boundaries beyond national jurisdiction in terms of the Scottish fleet or Scottish vessels get out beyond those 200 nautical miles? Because we're talking about an agreement that's going to be reached internationally in relation to all this stuff. So what levers does the Scottish Government currently have under its devolved?
I'm going to have to go to the lawyer for that. That's okay.
Okay, so we do currently regulate some activities beyond national jurisdiction. The way the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament works under the Scotland Act is in or as regards Scotland. And so the as regards Scotland is really crucial, because what we're talking about there is if there are activities that have some nexus with Scotland. So that could be, for example, a Scottish actor undertaking a particular activity beyond national jurisdiction. And so because the marine environment is a devolved matter, we do have legislative competence beyond national jurisdiction, provided it is as regards Scotland. And so I could give you a concrete example just now. Scottish ministers have got the licensing authority for deep seabed mining operations beyond national jurisdiction, but no Scottish actors are currently doing that, and there have been no applications. So things like that are currently regulated. Other examples would be in our marine licensing regime at the moment, we actually already legislate for certain activities anywhere at sea, and that could include. This is where actually clause 14 comes in, that we're rethinking the division of responsibilities for marine licensing between the UK and Scotland, because at the moment we do have some administrative arrangements in place, meaning that we use the MMO to regulate some Scottish actors beyond national jurisdiction, but it is within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. And to just give you a concrete example, rocket launches. So if there is a rocket launch in Scotland, when there's the different stages of the rocket launch, parts peel off typically into the ocean. So that potentially may need a licence, possibly from the MMO at the moment, maybe from Scottish ministers in future. So yeah, I'd say those are the main ones just now, but what we're conscious of is there are a lot of activities coming along now, like marine geoengineering, for example, carbon capture and storage, different types of energy as well, beyond national jurisdiction, maybe wave converters. And this comes back really to the complicated mix of reserved and devolved responsibilities in different areas.
Dr Dingwall, thank you for actually making it tangible and concrete. That's been quite a challenge for me this morning anyway. So if I've got it right, then and that I think I understand. The Conference of Parties, the Cabinet Secretary you're referring to, will involve the UK Government trying to reach an international agreement on a range of matters that are reserved, quite rightly, to them under the current constitutional settlement anyway, and matters that are devolved. So that needs both governments in Scotland being in lockstep in relation to those negotiations. What is the process for signing up to that between Scottish and UK governments? Has the Scottish Government given any assurance in relation to any of that?
So, ahead of any conference of the parties, and this is where it is quite important that the Scottish Government does have a presence at the conference of parties, whatever they might be. Before the UK Government goes to negotiate COP30 last month or any of the COPs, so they will give us an indication of where they're negotiating. When you're actually at COP, the hope is that you're able to at least find out from officials, from the Scottish, from UK ministerial team, how those negotiations are going. It's not I would say, very official, and it's not very concrete, unfortunately. We don't have a particular, I suppose, like constitutional role, as you put it, in terms of what the UK negotiations are. But certainly the Northern Irish and the Welsh and the Scottish Government usually attend the Conference of Parties, and we have meetings with the UK Government ahead of attendance. I mean, obviously, I would prefer it was formalised, that kind of discussion with the UK Government. But as it stands, the UK Government is making those decisions as to what they can sign up on behalf of the whole UK. I would like there to be more involvement in the Scottish, Welsh and the Northern Ireland Government in those agreements, but as it stands, it is. But I mean, it also depends on the flavour of government, as well as to how much they will include the devolved nations. And certainly ahead of COP30 in Brazil, we had a certain amount of sight as to where the UK's negotiation was in regards to what was agreed at COP30, and would expect that to continue and have that respect between the devolved governments and the UK Government. But fundamentally, the problem with the BBNJ bill is that when it was put together, there was that really complicated mix. I mean, you just heard about rocket launches and carbon capture and storage and all sorts of things that may or may not happen within those areas beyond jurisdiction. So it is a complicated mix of devolved and reserved impacts that would have, and that's why it's really important, as we agree to the BBNJ bill, and we have the legislative consent around that we're absolutely satisfied as a Parliament and as a government that we don't have situations where, like, future Secretary of States could be making decisions on what happens in the areas that affect devolved competence.
Can I just add just a little bit to that? That you were asking about forming positions at the Conference of the Parties for the BBNJ agreement, and so that you know where we're heading with things. And as the Cabinet Secretary said, we're all working to very, very tight timescales for a very complex and technical bill, I think the DPLR committee called it. So we've been exploring legislative and non-legislative means to do as the Cabinet Secretary set out, protect devolution and ensure that Scottish ministers and institutions have their right and proper place. We would expect, and this is part of what we will bring forward, is that there will be non-legislative agreement between governments that we'll also share with you, as well as any on-bill changes to protect devolution. So we've already discussed with the UK Government, and we would expect that the BBNJ agreement, Conference of the Parties, would follow the Concordat on International Relations that's part of the Memorandum of Understanding between devolved governments and the devolved administrations, that stipulates that we'll be consulted on matters to be decided at the Conference of the Parties, should they have devolved impacts. And we're exploring it with the UK Government, but we would expect that to be quite weighty involvement where there's devolved matters.
Now, irrespective of what's agreed at that Conference of the Parties, I take it the UK Government will have to bring in a whole suite of powers and regulations to give effect to whatever's agreed internationally, to make sure that organisations across the UK are complying with the UK's international obligations, and that's perhaps where it then invokes on devolved competencies. I think Dr Dingwall was talking about, well, if agreements are made more generally, but there's deep seabed mining, there's innovative licensing regimes. I'll not comment on rocket launches, carbon capture, wave power, where the Scottish Government would be acting in accordance with its rules and licensing regimes and regulations, though on a big UK layer that could dictate what that looks like at a Scottish level, which previously was devolved. And is that where the rub is in relation to this? Well, and that's where you're looking for consent from government and Parliament rather than just to be consulted on?
Yeah, so being consulted on, I don't think is worth pursuing. I don't think that, you know, effectively, what does that actually mean in practice? You just could effectively be told what's happening, either quite quickly before something's agreed or whatever. And I think we have the fundamental point of, like, first of all, you see with the BBNJ bill how late it was that we actually were able to actually find out that it was actually devolved competencies that were looked at as well. But it comes back to the fundamental point, Bob, that there are areas unknown in the future, which a Secretary of State could effectively, well, it wouldn't be leapfrogging the Scottish Parliament, because it would actually, if we consented to it as is, it would be perfectly legitimate, but we can't consent to it it is at the moment, because we need that consent so that we have that protection of devolved competence, so that we can't be leapfrogged in future situations.
Okay, that understand. Final and very brief question, Convener. The word alignment's kind of forming in my head. If the UK government, for all perfectly reasonable reasons, decides that under its international duties it wishes to consult with the Scottish Government and implement its own regime in boundaries beyond Scottish Government's direct control, if you like, in international boundaries, and there's one regime there, but a different regime within Scotland's boundaries, is there any possibility that the UK government could think, well, we're doing carbon capture different beyond 200 nautical miles, 195 nautical miles, we're doing it a different way, let's align that? Is there an alignment? I'm not saying danger, but is the idea of alignment so that we don't have one regime for international jurisdiction and Scottish jurisdiction that could have the UK government then bring in conditions for something that is overtly devolved? I hope I've expressed that correctly, the idea of alignment between what we do currently within the 200 nautical miles we keep hearing about and what will be agreed internationally beyond those 200 nautical miles.
I suppose that's a possibility, but again, I mean, maybe defer to the lawyers to give me the actual the lowdown on what it actually could mean, because I don't know how I can answer that without legal advice.
I think we're all flying blind.
Yeah, that's the issue. It's like, you know, what could be happening in the future and how might this impact? And you've raised a good point. Okay. Can I bring in?
Yeah,
Joanna?
no, thank you. It's a good point. I think part of the difficulty is they're quite complicated competencies, particularly in the marine space. And it would really be a case-by-case basis, depending on what the types of activities were. So under international law, law of the sea, typically there are various high seas freedoms. So there would be limits on the extent to which the UK could actually regulate in relation to the water column, say, beyond 200 nautical miles. So in certain topics, it'd be hard to conceive of there being comparable regimes within national jurisdiction waters and beyond, but it would be a case of really, I suppose, looking at all the different activities and thinking through the current legal rules, devolved and reserved competencies and executive competencies, and then working out things like high seas freedoms under the UN Convention and the Law of the Sea as well.
One general point, though, is that because we can't foresee what might actually happen, and because if we didn't have consent, then we couldn't, on a case-by-case basis, figure out the consequences that it might have on whatever scenario that there is. And without having consent, in fact, even merely having consult, I mean, consult, again, I think it's a very woolly term, and I don't think we should be signing up to be consulted when we should have consent. We wouldn't have that ability for the Parliament to scrutinise the consequences of a decision that was getting made for which we weren't included.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I'm not sure where that leaves the committee, but thank you.
I'm not, yeah. We are trying to negotiate, as I said, you know, we want to be able to tell the committee that we have been successful in the negotiations and we have actually come to conclusions that we are satisfied with, in the same way that we were with the amendment to clause 18, which was tabled at the Lords Committee yesterday, where we were happy, and that was involving environmental EIA regulations. So it can be done, and we're hopeful that it will be done.
Okay, thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, on a wider point, just help me so I can understand this. If you go on the UN member states, I think there's 193 plus 2 observers. They accept, therefore, there's 195. Now, there are 75 signatures to the BBNJ agreement, which is 38% of UN members have signed up to it. So what we're going to be doing is putting in force an agreement that less than half of the member states of the UN agree to. My question is, could you explain to me how this is going to be enforced? I mean, it's not just good enough to say that Scotland will enforce it with the actors that they have. How are we going to do it on the high seas, or the high seas just going to remain the high seas and anyone can do whatever they want? Because we don't seem to have full agreement to all of this. I just want to understand what policing is going to be done. What policing do you know?
I can understand why you're putting that question to me, but not being a signatory to the BBNJ bill as a nation
because
state.
if you're signing up to an LCM, Cabinet Secretary, you must have asked that very question. You wouldn't sign up to something without knowing how it's being policed, surely.
So, in regards to the previous question about who would enact everything associated with the BBNJ, it's the UK government. And we would have to, if in areas in which it actually impinged on devolved areas, we would obviously be scrutinising what that is. Parliament would be scrutinising what that is as part of having a consent mechanism embedded in the bill. So I can't, I suppose, pick out a potential scenario relating to what and predict what would actually happen and how the UK government would respond to that.
I guess I'm asking you if you're signing up to it. Sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I'm asking you if you sign up to an agreement or consent to it, you must know what the obligations are to Scotland, and I'm asking you if you know what those are. And at the moment, you're not saying anything.
You're putting forward potential scenarios in which the UK government are acting in an area of devolved competence and how we would interact with that. And that's why it's important that we have a consent mechanism, because at the moment I can't possibly give an answer to that question.
Okay.
But I can, maybe
Joanna might be.
Joanna, maybe I'm not understanding your question. But
I can rephrase it if you like. But Joanna,
well, I'll have a go at it. It's a difficult question, I'd say, with several layers, because on the one hand, obviously you're right, the BBNJ agreement, it isn't a universal agreement at the moment, and so it is very much reliant on the states parties will be enforcing it against their nationals primarily, and against their government vessels and such like. So it's reliant on globally everyone will be enforcing as against their own people and vessels. And already within the bill there are various civil and criminal sanctions contemplated for people who don't comply. In terms of enforcement of the high seas, that obviously is a challenge, but there are increasing methods, remote surveillance and such like. And also, I suppose, something to keep in mind is that typically actors on the high seas, they will be part of a corporate structure with funding and financing, and there are important legalities involved in that. So there's a huge investment risk for people who were going to go out there and act illegally. We see that with deep seabed mining, for example.
well, it's only illegal if you're signed up to the agreement. If you're not signed up to the agreement, you wouldn't be doing anything illegal. So 62% of the world is not signed up to it. That's my problem.
But our focus would be on Scottish actors, so ensuring the standards for them.
I'm not sure there is an answer to my question. But Kevin, I think you want to come in.
Thank you, Convener. And a couple of simple questions. Cabinet Secretary, neither you nor the Scottish Government have signed up to the agreement because it is an international agreement, and as you pointed out earlier, unfortunately at this moment in time we're not a nation state. Would that be correct?
That's true. So we're not a signatory because we're not a nation state. We support the aims of the BBNJ agreement, working hard to the UK government to support ratification of it. But your fundamental point is absolutely correct. I wasn't in the negotiations around BBNJ. We don't have a seat at the table in terms of the negotiations at the Conference of Parties. We rely on the UK government to give us information about how they're negotiating and what they're negotiating. We don't have any issues with the actual BBNJ agreement as it happens, but of course we have to make sure that when it is enacted by the UK government, that the areas that we have interest in the devolve sense that we have consent for, at least that we should expect.
And while it is not that great that we're dealing with this LCM in this manner, and that once again the UK government seems to ride roughshod over devolved competences, it would be much better overall if this were an independent parliament deciding on this as a whole, as an international signature.
Mr. Stewart, we leave politics at the door, and I don't think that's an appropriate question.
This is a parliament.
Mr. Stewart, with respect, you've made your point, which you've got on record. I actually don't think that that's appropriate, and I'm not going to allow that.
I'm sorry, convener, but this is
Mr. Stewart, Mr. Stewart, are you challenging my position as convener?
I am suggesting,
right,
convener, that you should point out to me in standing orders where you feel that my question is inappropriate.
I have made a ruling from my position as convener. You've made your point. You've got it on record. I don't think it's appropriate to take it any further. If you want to challenge my position, then I'll suspend the meeting and I'll deal with it in private. What would you like me to do, Mr. Stewart?
We will deal with that after the meeting, convener.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? No. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for giving evidence this morning, and I now suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of witnesses. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. This is our fifth item of business, is an evidence session on the Ecocide Scotland Bill with the member in charge, Monica Lennon. I welcome Monica's committee substitute. I obviously welcome you, Monica, but I'm going to come to that in a minute. But I welcome Monica's committee substitute for the bill, Sarah Boyatt, to this meeting. This will be our final evidence session before the committee reports on the agreed on the bill's general principles in early new year. No stage one deadline has yet been set by the Parliamentary Bureau, but the committee has proposed a deadline of the end of January, and I believe we're close to agreeing a timescale, hopefully this week. I therefore now welcome to the meeting Monica Lennon and her supporting officials. We've got Ros Thompson, the Principal Clerk from the Non-Government Bills Unit, and Ailey Callender, the Senior Solicitor for the Legal Services Officers of the Scottish Parliament. And Monica, is often the way, I'm going to start with the easy questions to start with.
Opening statement.
Sorry?
Opening statement.
But before I do that, Monica, you, of course, get an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Convener, and hello to the committee. I welcome the opportunity to give evidence on the general principles of the Ecocide Scotland Bill, and I thank the committee for your extensive scrutiny that you've undertaken so far. Scotland must be more ambitious and effective when it comes to environmental protection. I hope the bill is helping us to recognise that the most egregious acts of environmental destruction must be treated as serious crimes they are. I found the scrutiny process at stage one incredibly valuable, not least in providing reassurance to stakeholders about the bill's scope and, crucially, what it is not going to do. I want to be really clear on this point. The bill is not going to criminalise legitimate licensed activities. It's not going after businesses operating responsibly under current regulations. I will happily support the Scottish Government's proposed amendments on permits, which will make this fact abundantly clear. I also want to reassure the committee that the bill is not going to clog up the planning system. As a former planner, I know that the planning system already considers environmental impact and requires mitigating measures to prevent long-term harm. This bill is designed to sit far above that, at the top of the regulatory pyramid, to deter and punish acts of severe environmental destruction. The definition of ecocide in this bill is not a new legal invention, but is underpinned by familiar concepts in existing law, drawing from the Regulatory Reform Act of 2014, the RRA. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's confirmation that the Scottish Government is content with the definition. However, simply tweaking the RRA is not enough. The offence under the RRA is one of strict liability. It is not designed for the extremely serious nature of an ecocide offence. Changing the penalties, for example, from a maximum of 5 years imprisonment to 8 years, will not fundamentally alter how that offence functions. That is why we need a standalone crime where the mental threshold and the associated penalties are high, designed to sit above the RRA. This new offence gives the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service an essential additional option for prosecution for the more serious environmental crimes. Furthermore, I welcome the Government's proposed amendments that would ensure if the higher threshold for an ecocide conviction cannot be reached, alternative penalties under the RRA are still available. This tiered approach has precedent in other legislation, and I think it's a sensible step that will strengthen the bill. Turning to deterrence and changing behaviours, the severity of the penalty is an intentional and necessary deterrent. As the Law Society of Scotland observed, the new offence is expected to foster a change of behaviour towards environmental risk, acting as a clear, dissuasive message to those who may cause environmental harm. This is about changing corporate culture and sending an unmistakable signal that Scotland places the value of our nature above illegal profit. The support for this bill comes not just from environmental groups, but from within the compliance system itself, including trade union members in SEPA, who recognise the limits of the current legal framework. I'm confident that the issues raised during stage 1 were carefully considered during the drafting process of the bill. However, I'm pragmatic and I've been listening, and where there is evidence that a tweak would strengthen the bill, I'm prepared to act. I'll happily work with the government on amendments, specifically including a clear permit defence, re-examining the reverse burden of proof, amending the reporting obligation and adding an explicit alternative conviction procedure to ensure the bill is robust and delivers its core purpose. Finally, while my bill does not address the issues of existing resources for regulatory bodies or the lack of prosecutions under the existing legislation, I hope these areas are addressed by the government as a complementary action to this bill. Convener, in closing, the movement to criminalise ecocide is an international one, with many countries and the EU recognising the need for action. Scotland's nature is extraordinary, but we are also one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. The level of support for the bill should reassure us that the people of Scotland care and want to see severe environmental damage criminalised to protect current and future generations. That's why I hope the general principles of the bill will be welcomed by the committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Monica. I'm glad you got your opening statement in because it negated some of my questions I seemed to be keen to press. But let's go to the questions that I am keen to press. Can you just explain briefly what engagement you had with stakeholders and the wider public before you brought the bill forward, and also any areas or stakeholders who were against what you were doing or for it? Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. So there was a 14-week consultation on the proposal, and that started in November 2023 into the beginning of February 2024. There was a significant response to the consultation. More than 3,000 people, 379 responses. Of that total, that included 134 organisations. But the majority were from members of the public. Of those responses, a very high majority were fully supportive, just over 95%. A further 3% were partially supportive, and a very small minority, 34 respondents, which is just over 1%, were fully opposed to the proposal. You asked about opposition. Only one organisation was fully opposed to the proposed bill during that consultation, and that was the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. Alongside that formal consultation process, I've also initiated an expert advisory group, and that brings together people from the legal profession, academia, trade unions, scientists, people who represent community voice as well, and that's been a very, a bit like the committee, it's been another forum of sort of robust scrutiny and challenging questions. And there's been drop-in sessions in Parliament. There's been lots of ways where people in Scotland have asked their MSPs about it as well. So there's been a lot of media interest. So alongside this formal process, I feel that the initial consultation was quite extensive and seemed to capture the public's imagination.
Okay, thanks, Monica. And you've heard during the evidence sessions which you've attended that there is some concern over an overlap between Section 40 of the RRA and the Ecocide Bill. And the Cabinet Secretary, I think, has alluded that she is in principle happy with the general principles of your bill. Can you just explain to the committee and to me about why you decided to go for a separate offence rather than looking at amending Section 40 of the RRA?
Thank you, Convener. I'll just begin by saying, I think it's it's obviously fantastic the Scottish Government are supportive of the general principles, and we've had discussion for a number of years now about the direction of travel on ecocide law internationally, particularly given the decision that's been taken in the EU. And I'm very aware of the Scottish Government's policy to keep pace with the EU, but we wanted to explore, obviously how current regulations work, and, if it was possible to simply amend the RRA, would that be sufficient? My position is that that wouldn't be sufficient. As I think I've touched on in my opening remarks, the RRA is a strict liability offence, and what I hope the committee has learned through this process is that when we talk about ecocide offences, we are talking about the most severe environmental harm events that would probably only happen, you know, once every 10, 20 years. And because of the gravity of the harm and the gravity of the penalties, the bill differs from RRA because the guilty party it has to be proven that they have both a guilty mind and it was a guilty act. With strict liability, that's not the case under RRA. So with this bill, we have to prove intent or recklessness. And I think that is right, that the test should be there, because what we've consulted on and what the public have said that they support is that the punishment could be up to 20 years in prison. If government or parliament were to look at amending the RRA to increase the penalties, that could be done anyway for other reasons that the committee's aware of. But it doesn't fundamentally change what that offence is. It would still be a strict liability offence. So I prefer to think about it as that regulatory pyramid that you've heard other stakeholders mention, including the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. So it's not one or the other, but it's about how, you know, we have, you know, at the apex of that pyramid, we have the ecocide offence, and hopefully that strengthens the RRA. Obviously, there might be some amendments proposed that I'll look at, but I think fundamentally we need both. We need a standalone bill on ecocide, and we need to make sure that the RRA is operating properly. I know people have concerns about enforceability of that right now in the low number of prosecutions, but I think it's come through in the consultation and a lot of the evidence that we do need to have a separate offence.
Thanks, Monica. The next question comes from Douglas.
Thank you, Convener. And Monica, you mentioned that well, you just mentioned there, it's not one or the other. You know, it can be that maybe the ecocide route is going down, and then maybe that's not going to be, there's not enough evidence or whatever, and then they can switch to the RRA route. But I guess that would, we heard from the government last week, that would take alternative conviction provision. So have you had any discussions with the government about alternative conviction provision since you first introduced the bill?
Thank you for the question. So during this parliamentary term, I've had, you know, regular discussion with the Scottish Government about how we can give effect to ecocide law in Scotland. And that's included the issues that the Cabinet Secretary referred to in her evidence, and, you know, touching on the issue that you've raised today, Douglas. You know, I've been quite clear with the government that, you know, I'm very open to what they bring forward, and indeed other members. But again, it's clear that there's precedent in law already that the prosecutors and courts can look at, you know, other routes to prosecution. I think we see that in domestic abuse legislation, that there are other examples. What I want to do with this bill is to have another tool in the toolbox, and I don't want to tie the hands of prosecutors or the courts, and I don't think that the bill does that. But I think if an amendment helps to provide clarity, then I'm absolutely happy to work with the government on that for stage 2.
When we heard from the Crown Prosecution Service, they had concerns saying, well, if you go down, you know, one route and you don't, you know, if it's proved not guilty, then they couldn't go down the RRA route afterwards. But I guess with what the government was saying last week on the alternative conviction provision, then that would enable that to happen. You know, you're going down the ecocide route, right, we're not going to get a conviction, we'll go down the RRA route at that time. And it's just wondering if you've had any, and the government seemed open to that, but I just wondered if you've had any more discussions with the government around that and how that could be brought in to strengthen the bill.
Yeah, I also want to just reassure the committee that it is something that we considered, or I considered, at the drafting stage, and it wasn't in the bill, but I think the constructive points made by both the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service and the Government are helpful. There are already a number of statutory provisions which allow a court to convict of an alternative crime to that charge that is in the indictment. This means that the alternative charge is implied in the libel charge without having to be specified. The Minister and her officials have said in this case, this would mean that if the charge in relation to ecocide is not proved, then it would be possible to convict the accused of the lesser charge of significant environmental harm under Section 40 of the RRA if the facts proved against the accused amount to that offence. So I don't have a problem with that. I've had informal discussions with the Government since last week. You know, what I hear loudly from Government is they support the general aims. They've set out areas where amendments would be desirable, and I'm more than willing to work with Government on that.
It's just I'm trying to understand how the bill would be amended to incorporate the alternative conviction provision. But I guess that's something that the Government may bring forward at the next stage if it gets that far.
So I think the question is fundamentally about the power to convict alternative offences. So I think it's just ensuring that that discretion still applies to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. So, you know, after my time in the committee, I will be happy to discuss with the Government. I mean, if the Government wants to bring the amendments forward, you know, in the Cabinet Secretary's name, you know, I'll obviously respect that process and work with the Government, but I'm not putting up any obstacles to that. I think that this is something that can be cleared up easily in stage 2.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much, Douglas. Mark, I think you've got some questions you want to ask.
Yeah, I wanted just to sort of follow on from that and ask you about, you know, that standalone offence of ecocide. I mean, is there something quite different if somebody's convicted under ecocide, you know, leaving aside the penalties are obviously a lot higher, but is there something quite different between that and a conviction under Section 40 of the RRA? I mean, I'm just trying to understand, is there a sense that, you know, a corporation, for example, might be fined or, you know, get a heavy penalty under Section 40 of the RRA, but to a certain extent individuals can hide behind that within a corporation? I'm just trying to, I suppose as a committee, we're still trying to kind of wheedle out like the real strength of that standalone offence. So any reflections you've got on that from your expert working group or wider consideration would be good in terms of the value of that ecocide offence compared to what you know the cops may pursue through Section 40 of the RRA if they were to make a choice between one and the other.
Again, thanks for the question, Mark. So I think kind of just stepping back from some of the sort of more legal and technical points, what I've heard from the Expert Advisory Group and many other stakeholders is that when ecocide is being discussed internationally and with corporate organisations, what it's starting to do is bring to people's minds that, you know, that risk of you know, being prosecuted for ecocide. You know, there's huge reputational damage that comes with that. And I think serious people understand that we are talking about the most catastrophic environmental harm. You know, we're not talking about, you know, low-level offences that can be covered by the RRA just now. So what it hopefully will do is make sure that you know, decision makers, you know, the controlling minds of organisations are not going to be at all flippant or casual around environmental risks. So really it's about changing those corporate behaviours and changing that attitude to risk. I think in a domestic setting for Scotland, it gives our compliance system and our justice system another lever to pull. You know, I hope that the bill, if it becomes law, doesn't have to be utilised, because if we are dealing with an ecocide event in Scotland, that would be very, very serious. So the intention is for this to be that strong deterrent because of the reputational risk to, you know, corporations, for example. Also for, if I put them into the bracket of organised criminal gangs, we know that environmental crime is a fast-growing area of crime around the world, but we know there's a particular study looking at this in a European context, and often it's seen as low risk in terms of the fines, the custodial sentences, just that feeling that, you know, the consequences aren't really that serious. So with ecocide law, again, we're trying to change that, and it's about making sure that Scotland keeps up with our neighbours across the European Union and the many other countries around the world that are seeking to do this. I think as well that, you know, we've obviously talked a lot about what is happening in the EU, and that is about the criminalisation of ecocide level crimes. So is that important distinction from, you know, what we have in regulations right now? And, you know, because this bill is about saying you could go to prison for up to 20 years, you know, it's getting that into the mindset of decision makers as well. I mean, I think the question that I suppose Douglas Lumsden put to the Cabinet Secretary last week, if he was playing devil's advocate, is would this put investors off coming to Scotland? And, you know, the concern that we would all have is, you know, why would any corporation want to get away with something like ecocide? So it's about making sure that ecocide is really beyond the pale and something that would not be tolerated in any jurisdiction. And I think the example in Belgium, the revision to the Belgian Penal Code, you know, what we're seeing in France and other countries shows that Scotland wouldn't be, we're not going to be the first, we're not going to be the outlier. We're seeing many other jurisdictions do this.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we've had some evidence about, you know, this being a deterrent effect. I'm just wondering if you could expand that a bit more, because I'm interested in how, you know, what's been put into place in the European Union, as you say, more of an emphasis now on seeing this as a criminal offence, how that has perhaps changed the conversation or not with regulators and corporations. I mean, what is the impact of having ecocide there in legislation? Practically, has it actually changed that conversation? Is it now seen as more of a deterrent, and how do you what evidence do you have of that?
I mean it's difficult to quantify. When something hasn't happened, it's hard to prove, you know, why it didn't happen. But to your point about is it changing the conversations, then I would say absolutely yes. When I first stumbled across this concept and this movement for ecocide law in 2021 and the build up to COP, I didn't really know that much about it, but, you know, in the years since then, you know, it feels like every other week there's an announcement from some other country, other part of the world, and, you know, whether it's, you know, at the UN or, you know, discussions that have been taken to the International Court of Justice, you know, this is becoming more of a mainstream topic. I've seen a number of briefings from, you know, high-profile law firms to their clients, preparing them for ecocide law, not just domestically, but internationally as well. So I think already even the prospect of ecocide law becoming a reality has got people thinking. And when I listen to Jojo Mehta, who's the CEO of Stop Ecocide International, she talks about the business engagement that they've been having around the world, where big corporations are now putting ecocide law in their risk register because they're taking it very seriously, and I suppose forecasting that this could become an international crime in a matter of years, as well as already seeing ecocide law emerging in lots of jurisdictions. So it's not just this abstract concept any longer. You know, ecocide law is becoming mainstream, and obviously the European Crime Directive, member states will have to, you know, sort of fully transpose or adopt that by May of next year.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds pretty concrete if corporations are putting ecocide into their risk registers, because that's going right up to the top, right up to board level, right up to, and it cuts across their legal fiduciary duties as companies. So I'm interested in that. Is there any more evidence from the corporate world about how practice is changing as a result of ecocide? You've identified one there.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think some of the submissions in the original consultation picked this up. I'm not certain if it's been something that was in the call for views submissions, but there's organisations like, I'm going to get this name wrong, but I think it's People for Pensions, where, again, it's just trying to do things more ethically and more responsibly. And I think, you know, we've all seen examples of companies being lobbied for perhaps being perceived not to be acting ethically. So, you know, there's huge public support for ecocide law. You know, it's not just about who responded to my bill. There's been extensive public polling across the G20 nations, and there's significant support in every one of those countries for this. Again, on that deterrent effect, it's something I think it's hard to prove, but a number of stakeholders have touched on it, that they believe it would have that effect. And I think if the bill was to be approved, we would expect some publicity around it, and for the Scottish Government and others to be bringing this into mainstream conversation in Scotland, alongside any training for people who might be professionally impacted by it. So I'm happy to provide the committee with more information about if it's specifically from the business and corporate world, but I'm very confident that those conversations are happening and can share some information with the committee.
Thanks, that's helpful. I think it adds to evidence that we've had already. If I could just move briefly on before other colleagues come in, just on the definition of ecocide. We've spent a bit of time, you'll have seen as a committee, looking at the terms that are in your bill about widespread, long-term, you know, definition there of 12 months. I mean, there's kind of no definition of serious adverse effects, but I'm just interested in your reflections on the evidence that we've had, in particular, you know, some of the concerns around those specific terms, and what your response is at this point to those as you head into stage one.
Thank you for that, Mark. So, as I said in my opening remarks, you know, not try to invent something new here. So that's where we're seeing similarity with the RRA in terms of definition, and I think it's a positive that the Scottish Government are saying that they accept the definition in the bill. You know, I think there's rightly questions just seeking clarity. I think there's been a number of questions around how would we define widespread, for example, or how can we be sure what that means. I think on that, again, it would depend on the exact circumstances. I think we have to look at these on a case-by-case basis. But, I mean, what I would ask colleagues to think about when we think about ecocide is to think about the harm that is being caused. And, you know, if it's something that's quite low level, someone asked me last week, if something like silly string on the high street, which is causing nuisance and littering, would that constitute ecocide? Now, obviously it wouldn't, because it's not causing widespread long-term environmental harm. So I think it's easier to rule out, you know, what it isn't. But what I've tried to do, and hopefully the committee sees that, is stick to, you know, established definitions. But again, if there are particular points that the committee wants reassurance on, I'm happy to try and provide that.
You might have seen we did have some evidence. I think it was from Nature Scott who were suggesting that, you know, 12 months is not an ideal definition of long term, because it's very difficult to see how any ecosystem can recover even from, you know, a relatively minor environmental impact over that kind of timescale. So, you know, there are some questions over particular definitions that are in the bill, and I suppose the question for us as a committee is, you know, do we have the opportunity to really think through a lot of that detail ahead of what could be quite a quick stage 2 debate, you know, coming on the back of a stage 1. So, you know, your response to those questions at this point, I think, is quite important.
Okay. So I think the issues of widespread and long-term, that they have come up a few times. The requirement for long-term damage comes from the expert panel definition on ecocide. That was the international definition, which I've tweaked a little bit. And the panel defines long-term damage as damage which is irreversible or which cannot be redressed through natural recovery within a reasonable period of time. We used 12 months because that was recognisable and there is a body of case law around it. But, you know, obviously NatureScot are an important stakeholder in this conversation. So I appreciate you've heard evidence suggesting that a derogation for 12 months could be required in certain circumstances. I think if the committee thinks that the addition of a specific time frame isn't necessary, and that the bill should be amended to reflect that, then again, I'm amenable to that.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Mark. Bob, I think you've got some questions now.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Just get a few questions. We're kind of just reading over evidence we had in relation to what we mean by ecocide. Is it a catastrophic single incident that caused widespread and obvious damage? And whether it's a kind of course of conduct by a single operator over a much longer period of time with incremental damage leading to what some may interpret as ecocide. I'm just conscious looking at my notes that Environmental Standards Scotland said it was not clear how the cumulative impact of a number of events over an extended period would be captured. But then the Crown Office took a different view. It said the definitions in relation to course of conduct are pretty clear in the provision. So we've got conflict, if you like, in the evidence that we've heard. It'd be quite helpful what the policy intent is, and did you consider all of this in developing the bill? So what's your view on how the definition may capture this type of harm? So are the provisions clear in the bill, and what's the policy intent in relation to it?
Thanks, Bob. Well, maybe pick up on the policy intent first, because hopefully that will be quite helpful. So the intention behind my bill is to prevent mass environmental damage and destruction from taking place due to crimes of ecocide. And one of the ways I'm trying to do that is by having these really strong punishments to act as a deterrent. The policy objectives, and I'll just run through them if that's helpful, is to ensure that serious environmental offences are treated as criminal offences. So that, again, that's that distinction from the RRA. Acting as a deterrent to individuals and companies, and ensuring that our domestic legislation maintains alignment with the EU. In terms of some of the points that you've made there, particularly around cumulative impact, or I think you're maybe sort of getting at sort of incremental steps. Again, I think the starting point needs to be is what is the harm, what is the extent of the harm that's been caused, and then working back from there to see whether the elements of the offence are established, and then to bring it back to the bill, that is whether the person intended to cause the environmental harm or was reckless as to whether that harm was caused. And this is what's different from the RRA. We're under strict liability. That mens rea test isn't applied. It's just simply that, you know, the act has happened, but the court doesn't have to prove that there was intent or reckless conduct. So in terms of an ecocide level event, something could happen over a period of time, but the main point I'm asking the committee to think about is what is the harm that was caused, and can it be proven that that was intentional or reckless conduct that led to that harm?
That's helpful, Monica. I know there's like a threshold by which you would apply whether the criminal offence, the test for the criminal offence has been met, but you've said over a period of time, and I suppose that's what I'm trying to flush out a little bit, because there's an event and there's a process where there could be a distinction, maybe not in terms of the eventual outcome of what could be defined as ecocide, but if a company or a farmer or an organisation is doing something in good faith or not is the case, maybe that would have to be established, of course, over the last 10 years. From one year to the next, the test for ecocide may not be met, but if you were to go from 2011 to 2021 and you compared, I did a compare and contrast over the biodiversity or anything else, then a stark change and perhaps the test has been met. So is there a particular time period that has to be applied, or is it completely open-ended? So course of conduct over 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, irrespective, I suppose, of what the threshold actually is for reckless and what have you?
So again, I just want to be really clear about, you know, that the starting point should be what is the harm that's been caused, and then I think, you know, whether it's SEPA investigating and then the Crown Office of Procurator Fiscal Service try to look at the evidence as to, you know, what caused this to happen and what was the intent. Hopefully I've set out in my opening remarks that I have listened to evidence and I've heard the government's intention to provide clarity for, you know, activities and individuals that have a permit. So if an activity has a permit and people or organisations are acting within the limits of that permit, then they're not going to cause environmental harm. Like ecocide will not arise if people are sticking to the parameters of a permit. If we have a situation where there's an incident of ecocide, there's a case being prosecuted, then the starting point is what is the actual damage. It could be as part of that analysis. It could be that this was something that perhaps was occurring over a period of weeks, a period of months, or it could have been just like, boom, something that just happened in a single day. But that will very much depend on the circumstances of that particular case and that particular offence. What I'm trying to do is show that there is a difference between RRA and a difference between this bill, and we're not looking to go after individuals and businesses who have a permit and are carrying that out lawfully. This is about, you know, that severe environmental destruction where there is evidence of intent or recklessness, that the perpetrator closed their mind to the potential damage that they were causing.
I think that is helpful, Monica. I won't push further other than just a tiny bit of clarity, and I think that what you've said previously about operating under licence and permit has been quite helpful, but there's no specific time period. So theoretically, if someone meets the threshold that you put on record there, Monica Lennon, but the event occurred over a longer process, over a number of years, they could still meet the threshold for ecocide. So it's not, you mentioned weeks, months, an individual event, but it could be over a number of years. I'm just wanting to get clarity on that. It could theoretically be over a number of years.
So I think I understand the point that you're getting at, Bob, but I bring it back to what is the harm that has been caused? What is the harm that's been investigated? What does the evidence say? Was there intent? Was there reckless conduct? If it's evident that mens rea can't be proved, then it could be that the regulators, the police, etc., would be looking to see, is this something that's breached the limits of its permit? And then that would be looked at under the existing regulations, which others are perhaps more expert than me to comment on. So if you have a permit and perhaps it's not been apparent initially that there's been you know, a breach of that permit, then there could be damage that was occurring over a period of time. But again, that would be down to individual circumstances. You know, and I think in all of these matters, it will be a case-by-case assessment. That's why I think having the option of investigating, is this an ecocide offence, which should be a very serious criminal matter, or is it something under the current regulations, which is a strict liability offence, and you're familiar with how that operates?
That is helpful. A number of witnesses have suggested to the committee that an ecocide offence should explicitly cover omissions or failures to act, as well as the Section 40 of the RRA does, as I understand it. The Cabinet Secretary last week seemed to say that that wouldn't be necessary because the bill, as worded, would cover that anyway. So I'm just wondering, is it the policy intention of the bill to include emissions as well as acts? And are you satisfied that if that is the case, the bill's clear on that?
So again, I just want to reinforce the point that under the bill, the ecocide offence is not a strict liability offence, unlike the offence of significant harm in the RRA. Under this bill, a person commits an offence if they intend to cause environmental harm or are reckless as to whether environmental harm is caused. Recklessness requires a person to close their mind to the consequences of their actions and whether any environmental harm would result. And recklessness is accepted as sufficing to constitute a criminally guilty mind, which I felt was important given the serious nature of the proposed crime and punishment. As I said, up to 20 years in prison, unlimited fines, publicity notices, compensation orders, versus omission, which does not necessarily involve knowledge or a high degree of culpability. So that was my reasoning on that.
Okay, so I suppose just, again, I'm not required to push further. Just for the record, you don't think the bill needs amended. I mean, the government doesn't think the bill needs amended in relation to this, but we're asking you as the member leading the in charge of the bill whether you think there's need for any greater clarity, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would be open to looking at any recommendations the committee makes, but I would say I'm in the same space as the Scottish Government on this. I mean, I think there's been some strong points made about it, but again, it's if we're looking at, you know, the criminal law with these high penalties, I think it's really important that the mens rea test is in there. And I think on the point of omission, that would not necessarily involve knowledge or a high degree of culpability. So from where I'm sitting, if someone is potentially facing 20 years in prison, I think it's really important that there is that proof of intent or recklessness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I think, Michael, you've got questions next to be followed by Kevin.
Morning. I want to just stick with the issue around thresholds of liability, and in particular the provisions that you've made within the bill. You've heard and read some of the evidence which we've received, which raises questions about whether the threshold is appropriate, largely on the basis that it doesn't include negligence within the provisions as it stands at the moment. It's intent or recklessness for Section 1, and the other one in responsible officials is consent or convivence. Can you maybe explain why you've chosen not to include negligence within this provision?
Thank you, Michael, for the question. I mean, it was given detailed consideration during the drafting process, and it was recognised that, I suppose, all three possibilities, consent, connivance or neglect, you know, are provided for in the RRA, but there are also circumstances where neglect is not. I suppose the rationale is that consent and connivance both require a high degree of knowledge and of fault, whereas neglect does not necessarily involve knowledge or a high degree of culpability. Therefore, in some circumstances, it may be unfair to allow individual criminal liability to be founded on neglect alone.
Okay. Are you of the view that you think the existing threshold is sufficient, or are you of the view that you think there may be a need to amend the existing threshold on the basis of the evidence that you've heard to date?
Amend it in what way?
To include negligence.
At the moment, I'm not persuaded on that, but again, if it's something that the committee felt strongly on based on evidence, I would look at that for stage 2.
Okay, thanks. In terms of the definition of responsible individuals, can you maybe just clarify exactly what the policy intention of the bill is? in responsible individuals? Because we've had some evidence to suggest that the table that you've provided in section 3.4 of the bill is likely to also include what might be viewed as being non-senior staff. Is that the intention of the bill, and if not, how would you seek to address that?
Thank you. So, under section 3 of the bill, my intention was to ensure that only individuals at a senior level in organisations would be specified. And I think it goes back to the point I was trying to make to Mark Ruskell about, those controlling minds in the organisation, and I suppose where the power lies in organisations. So it is about, those who have that overall oversight. So my view was that in terms of prosecution, that's who should be aimed at. The other clear intention I had was that individuals at a lower level in the organisation that you could envisage as middle management or below would not be subject to prosecution under section 3. This was something that came across strongly from the expert advisory group, which has been in place for a while now, which includes trade union representation, but others. And we had recommendations in the consultation from Unison Scotland and the Centre for Climate, Crime and Justice, who all raised concerns about the punishment of workers. There were also some recommendations that the bill should include some additional protections for whistleblowers, which is not something that I felt I was able to put into the bill, but there's been quite a lot of discussion around this, and I know it's been playing out in the evidence as well at stage 1.
So, if as you have just now with the responsible official definition, if a non-senior member of staff acts in such a way that they would be committing an offence under this legislation, including within section 3, who should be prosecuted?
Well, I think that will all depend on the evidence. The evidence will point to, the guilty mind.
To the individual who's not a senior member of staff, which results in an offence being committed under this bill if introduced, who should be prosecuted?
I think it's important to be clear that this is not unique to the Ecocide bill. Employees are not immune from potential conviction where it's proven that they have committed the criminal offence, in this case ecocide. For the ecocide offence to occur, the person, and whether that's the employee or the employer, must cause severe environmental harm and intend to cause that harm or be reckless. So again, it comes back to those points about intent and recklessness. And it will be for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service to determine on the evidence available to them if an ecocide offence has been made out and who should be charged. Again, I don't say this naively, but I really hope that we don't have to use the ecocide law, as I've said in the policy memorandum and in the financial memorandum. We're estimating that this would be rare, possibly once every 10 or 20 years. And if it doesn't meet those thresholds of ecocide, then it would be dealt with under other regulations. But by having ecocide law, organisations will have a responsibility to make sure that good practice and knowledge percolates throughout the organisation. And I hope that actually protects workers and middle managers from the threat of prosecution, but also from the impact of any ecocide level crime. So, these are important questions. And a lot of it will come down to what the evidence says in any particular case, but hopefully, you know, workers and managers won't be in that situation of their organisation being investigated for ecocides.
Sure. So just so I'm clear then, so if the policy intention is clearly is to target senior management, as you mentioned, if the threshold liability in section 1 around intent and recklessness by the actions of a non-senior member of staff, they would still be liable under this legislation if it was enacted. Is that correct? My understanding of it.
Yeah, I think at that point it might just be helpful to bring in Rose Thompson, if that's okay, Rose.
Yeah, just in terms of the drafting process, the Regulatory Reform Act includes a manager, which is a lower, would be considered to be a lower level member of staff, and Monica Lennon specifically asked for the term manager to be left out of the table that you refer to because of exactly that, responding to concerns from Unison and others about overcatching very low graded members of staff. So that was deliberately, the drafting deliberately seeks to avoid that. And obviously there are existing provisions in existing legislation that should somebody feel that they have been coerced to act in a particular way by somebody senior in an organisation, they would already be able to use that as a defence, so it doesn't need to be in the bill. And just the other thing to add is, of course, if somebody did something and somebody much more senior in the organisation was aware of that, then of course through vicarious liability, the more senior individual could be prosecuted. Yeah,
but just so I'm clear in my understanding of this. Under section 1, the requirement for intent and recklessness is that if there's evidence to suggest that a non-senior member of staff has acted in such a way, they would be prosecuted under this. They could be prosecuted under this bill. I know the policy intention. What I'm trying to be clear about is that, although that might be the stated intention, the provisions of the bill do not prevent a non-senior member of staff from being prosecuted. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think I've made the policy intention clear, as Rose has helpfully explained. But I think on the particular legal point, I think probably best to bring in the lawyer. So, Ailey, is that okay for you to address that point?
Thank you. It was just to confirm that, yes, if the elements of the offence were made out, they could be prosecuted. Obviously, whether to bring a prosecution would be a decision for the Crown Office. And then it would be important to also consider the vicarious liability provisions in Section 4, which would provide, if that person was an employee, the employer could also be prosecuted. And subsection 4 of that Section 4 confirms that proceedings could be taken against the company or the employer, irrespective of whether they're taken against the employee. So I suppose it comes back again to whether the elements of the offence are made out, and then that prosecutorial decision will be one for the Crown Office.
Yeah, so just so we're clear here is that although there's a policy intention, the provisions of the bill could be applied to any employee.
It could be applied to any individual.
Any individual could be prosecuted under the terms of this bill as it's drafted.
Yes, any individual, regardless of what capacity.
Okay. Can I just pick up on another point? You would have heard from the evidence from the Cabinet Secretary last week, where the Scottish Government consider that the bill as introduced is not compatible with ECHR, specifically referring to sections 2(3), which is in relation to establishing the defence of necessity and the balance of probabilities. Do you believe that the Scottish Government's view that this is not compatible with ECHR is correct? And if so, what consideration did you give to that at the time when you were drafting this particular provision within the bill?
Well, I don't disbelieve the Scottish Government. As you know, Michael, the Scottish Government doesn't share its legal advice with people out with the government, but you know, we've had good discussions about this, and it's something that they raised early on in our dialogue, and I suppose to an extent I've had to accept what the government says on it. But I think if it's helpful, I can maybe just set out, you know, why I included defensive necessity in that way. And then again, just to reinforce the point I made in my opening remarks, that, you know, happy to work with the government on the amendment I think that they're going to bring forward. So Section 2 provides for the defence of necessity, which a person may use if charged with ecocide. The defence is that a person's actions were carried out to prevent greater harm occurring, and that the prevention of harm was necessary and reasonable. Under the bill, the person charged with ecocide is responsible for demonstrating on the balance of probabilities that they had such a defence. Included this defence because I felt that there may be very rare circumstances where a person could conceivably act in a way that may risk ecocide to prevent a greater harm, such as avoiding significant loss of human life. In terms of Article 6.2 of ECHR, I considered the reverse onus provision, as did the presiding officer, and we concluded that it was reasonable, or it was within the reasonable limits permitted by the Convention, and therefore within legislative competence of this Parliament. That said, I think the points set out by the Scottish Government, you know, are persuasive, because they're saying that the reverse burden, it could be problematic during a trial in practical terms, and that's why an evidential burden may be more suitable. So again, I think, you know, you said, do I believe the government? I don't disbelieve the government. So if they are happy to bring forward amendments, then again, I won't be objecting to that.
Okay, and maybe just to follow up on that then, I think that's helpful. And I'm very conscious that as a member in introducing the bill, you're relying on advice to come from a non-executive bills unit and also from the Parliament's legal team as well. Can I ask the Parliament's legal team specifically, why did you not identify this lack of compatibility with ECHR?
As Monica set out, this was given careful consideration during the drafting process of the bill, and as the committee heard last week, it comes down to a question of proportionality, and the Convention does not prohibit reverse onus provisions, reverse burdens within criminal offences, and there are in other bits of legislation, including in around mental disorder and domestic abuse, and it was felt that this was an appropriate provision in this context, where the individual accused would be best placed to know what was in their mental state at the time of the offence, and it was considered that this was within the reasonable limits permitted by the Convention. But as the members set out, if it's a question of putting that beyond doubt, for the reasons set out by the Scottish Government, the members is considering that.
And can I just clarify, from the Parliament's point of view, do you consider it's compatible?
So it's for the member and for the presiding officer to separately consider it.
I'm just asking you directly, given you're the lawyer and giving advice on this, do you consider that it's compatible?
So I think it's really for those to look at both those statements that were given when the bill was introduced in terms of the presiding officer, which is a separate assessment, and the member as well. So
you consider it's compatible then?
So I think it comes down to a question of proportionality, and it's a fine line, and that's why it's where that line is drawn.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. Kevin, the next questions are from you.
Thank you. First of all, I would refer members to my register of interests. As Unison have been mentioned, I am a member of Unison. The bill itself does not provide a defence for an operator of permitted, licensed or consented activities. You'll be aware, Ms Lennon, that the committee has heard mixed views on this, with some considering that consented activities would be unlikely to reach the mens rea standard of intent of recklessness. But also, there have been some extremely serious concerns about regulatory certainty in all of this. Why did you take the decision not to include permitting defence in the bill? And what is your current position on this issue, having heard all of the evidence that we have?
Thank you, Kevin, for your questions today, but also your questions throughout the stage 1 evidence. I think it has helped to, improve people's understanding of what the Regulatory Reform Act does already, and also, bringing into the discussion the really important role of planning authorities and others in the consenting regime. And I'm, reassured that, in principle, the planning authorities who have responded have said they support the aims of the bill, but I think legitimate questions have been asked. So,
Ms Lennon, we'll come to consenting bodies, including planning authorities, in a little while. I'm first of all asking about the operator viewpoints, and we heard from the likes of the NFU, from fishermen's organisations, from others, that they had concerns about the fact that this bill could cover activities which have been consented, permitted, licensed. So if we could deal with the operators first, and then we can maybe come to the individual consenting bodies, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I think I've set out these points in earlier answers, but the Ecocide Bill is to introduce a criminal offence of ecocide, and for a successful prosecution to happen, there has to be evidence that there was intent or reckless conduct. And this is a distinction with those organisations who have permits, who are already subject to the RRA, which is a strict liability offence. So, I can't think of an example where a member of the NFU or the Fishermen's Federation has went out there with intent or recklessness to cause ecocide. You've mentioned the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. They opposed the bill in the consultation because they said that they don't think there's a need for any more environmental legislation. NFU Scotland gave a fairly neutral response in writing to the committee. When they came to committee, I think they went a bit further, but we had a roundtable discussion with NFU Scotland where I spoke to many members round the table, and they were really positive about the bill, and they felt that it would give them protection from bad actors. So this is not about going after businesses in your region or in my region who have legitimate business, have a consent or permit, operate within that. This is about situations where there has been intent or recklessness that has caused severe environmental destruction of the scale that could be a 1 in 20 year event, something pretty catastrophic.
They have suggested that this bill, as it is drafted, creates a huge amount of legal uncertainties. Are you willing, at future stage, to have amendments which provides a defence for operators of permitted, licensed or consented activities? So, I don't think I do accept that the bill is causing a huge amount of legal uncertainty because, we've heard good evidence from the Law Society of Scotland, we've heard from KCs, we've heard from a number of stakeholders that this, will, sit at the apex of environmental... Well, I know the member disagrees, but will sit at the top of that pyramid, and I hope will help to strengthen the application of the RRA as well. This would give the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service options. I suppose it unsettles me that there are perhaps certain trade bodies or certain industries or businesses who are very frightened by the prospect of ecocide law. What we're all trying to do, I think, collectively, because it has been a cross-party endeavour, even though I am the member, it's got a huge amount of cross-party support, is to make sure that we can prevent ecocide from happening as much as possible. But it is really important if a business or individual has a permit, has a licence, that they can operate that
in good faith within the confines of that permit. And that's also important about giving certainty to those in the regulatory space. So I don't have any concerns about that, having worked professionally in that space for a long time before I came to Parliament. So I think we have legal certainty about the RRA and when it can be applied and when it can't. And we're setting out very clearly that, you know, the threshold for ecocide crime is very, very high, and there needs to be evidence of intent or recklessness.
So you mentioned the RRA there, and that provides for certain defences. Don't you think that your ecocide bill should act in a similar manner to the RRA in that regard? And I think the fear and the legal uncertainty from some of these organisations is not that they think they're doing anything wrong at this moment, which would necessarily lead to an ecocide, but it may well be that some future scientific discovery shows that something that they have done over a long period of time maybe has caused some difficulties. I think that these are the unknowns that these folks are really quite worried about. And I think it's a genuine worry. I don't think, you know, it's blockage for the sake of blockage.
Okay, no, that's a helpful recap of that. But I think, you know, I know I can provide reassurance on that. I'll just repeat the point I made in my opening statement, that I'm happy to work with the government on amendments, including a clear permit defence. But I just want to make the distinction that, you know, if there is intent and recklessness that goes beyond something that's covered in a permit, then potentially we could be looking at the ecocide offence. But if the people that you have in mind, Mr Stewart, are operating lawfully with their permit, then they don't have to worry about this.
It's not me that has to be convinced in some regards, it's them that has to be convinced around about some of this.
With the government on that amendment, they said last week that that's something that they would want to address. So a clear permit defence, I think that can be addressed easily at stage 2.
So equally, there's no defence in the bill that would apparently prevent a consenting body from being held liable for ecocide. And you started to go over some of the issues that we have had from planning authorities. Those letters have come in after I raised issues at committee around about aspects of this. And I think it would be fair to say that some people didn't really think there was an issue around about this. I think the letters from local authorities quite clearly show that they have concerns as well around about that aspect of the bill. So again, you've said that you'll work with the government and look towards amendments. But are there circumstances where you believe that a regulator should be held liable for causing severe environmental harm through authorised acts?
So again, I'll respond to that by just bringing the member back to the policy aim. So what I'm seeking to do here is to prevent severe environmental destruction. So that is the harm, this is the motivation. We're trying to prevent ecocide level crimes. You know, planning authorities, for example, every single day assess environmental impact. They look at potential harm. If an element of harm is identified that could result from a development, they also then look at mitigation that could be put in place. So planners are pretty skilled in dealing with that every day. I think in terms of the question around why isn't there a defence for a regulator or a licensing body from being held liable for ecocide under the bill, I'll just go over what's already in Section 40. So there are specific provisions in Section 40 of the RRA to provide that those granting relevant permits, for example, regulators like SEPA, are not committing an offence. And this is necessary given it's a strict liability offence. Under the bill, for an ecocide offence to occur, the person must cause severe environmental harm and intend to cause it, or be reckless as to whether environmental harm is caused. I'm finding it quite difficult to think of a scenario where a regulator or a licensing body would intend or be reckless in causing environmental harm when they're permitting relevant activities. But in supporting the government proposal...
An example, if I could, Ms Lennon. You know, planners, councillors when they're taking decisions, planning ministers where they're taking decisions often have fine balancing acts, looking at everything that is going on in a particular place before giving a permission. Now, sometimes you see a situation whereby advice is given saying that there may be an impact on a particular species, which may be a rare species, and folk are not certain about the outcome of what may happen if that permission goes ahead, right? And folk have to make their decision around about that. But if they've made a decision in favour, and then it's later found that there has been an impact on a species, which some may regard to be an ecocide because it is a major impact, what then happens and who is liable? And I think these are the unanswered questions that are in the minds of many folk, which again creates that legal uncertainty.
Look, I think we could start to get into some hypothetical situations, but you know what I would say in terms of when planning authorities are weighing up these possible environmental harms and looking at the likelihood of that, you know, I think we already through legislation have to apply the precautionary principle, and I think, you know, whether it's through the National Planning Framework 4 and other guidance available to planning authorities, you know, we have a very established regime of environmental impact assessment. Mr Stewart knows as a former planning minister that, you know, planning authorities have to set out their reasoning and have to be very clear on the material considerations that have been taken into account if they're going to approve a development or depart from, you know, the local development plan in any way. So I think if there is you know, an awareness that there could be a particular protected species within a locality, it possibly could be affected in some way. If that's already been, you know, identified, but reasoning has been given as to why the planning authority is satisfied, you know, because, I don't know, there could be, you know, mitigation put in place around, you know, a buffer zone around an area where bats are known to fly or whatever. But, you know, again, if there comes a point where the Crown Office are looking at an ecocide case and they're trying to work out how did this happen, how did this harm, how did this severe environmental destruction happen, who was responsible, who closed their mind to this, who, you know, intentionally caused this to happen or acted in a reckless manner. I just can't think of a circumstance where what you've described about planning officers, councillors, a planning minister looking at the best available evidence could be found guilty, you know, of intending to cause that ecocide event.
So again, I go back to my point that some folk feel that there is legal uncertainty around about this. I think, you know, as we have explored this, I think there are a number of unintended consequences around about some of the draft bill as is. You have said that you're willing to work with the government and others to amend the bill. I think that's admirable, and we would expect that. And I don't think anyone is against the spirit of this bill. But I think that there needs to be some further exploration around about possible amendments as well to this. And I wonder if you would be favourable to that. And do you think that there is actually enough time within this parliamentary term to do that, to ensure that we take cognizance of the real concerns that have been brought forward by operators and by consenting authorities?
I am confident that the Parliament has time to progress the bill if it goes beyond stage 1. Obviously, we know it's for any member to bring forward amendments. So, like I've said to the government, I'll work with any member to listen carefully, and if there is significant evidence that amendments are required in the areas that Mr Shear's talking about, you know, I will be open to listening. I think the points that have been made about planning authorities already feeling, I suppose, a burden about workloads, resourcing, having another thing to take into account. I'm very sympathetic to planning authorities who are saying, oh, you know, we already deal with very complex issues, and if you ask us to think about anything else, we need the resources. So I'm very alive to that. I think that today, by being very, very clear that when we talk about ecocide offences, it's something way beyond RRA. It's the most serious, catastrophic environmental impact that you can think of. And for an individual, for a natural or legal person to be prosecuted and convicted, then it has to be proven that there was intent or recklessness. As somebody who worked as a Chartered Town Planner for more than 12 years before I came here, I'll declare that my husband is currently in a planning authority. I don't want him to go to jail because he'll make my dinner every night. But, you know, the serious point is, you know, I respect the really important work that our planning authorities do and others involved in the consenting regime. This bill is not aimed at them. And I've been very clear why, because of the criminal sanctions, including up to 20 years in prison, that mens rea test, which doesn't occur under RRA, which is strict liability, is really, really important. And I just can't think of a circumstance where a planning authority, given all the checks and balances from the case officer to the planning committee, and if Mr Stewart is correct that in some cases the planning minister would be the decision maker, having sat in Victoria Quay and provided advice to ministers on these matters and knowing all the checks and balances, you know, I just cannot imagine a situation where anyone in the planning system would have the intent or act with recklessness to allow something like ecocide to occur. And I'm quite confident all these other countries that are legislating to give effect to ecocide law, including in Belgium and other examples that the committee's heard about, they will have had these same discussions, but they are able, within their own jurisdictions, to progress the law. And I'm very confident. I have every faith in my colleagues in this room and across the Parliament that we can, focus our minds on what are the policy aims, what are the general principles. A number of amendments have been discussed already, particularly by the government, and we are advancing those discussions.
Finally, very briefly, a lot of the evidence has suggested that stronger enforcement of the existing law is as important, if not more important, than creating a new offence itself. At any point, did you think around about looking at strengthening Section 40? And did you at any point think that one of the ways of putting ecocide in the statute book itself would be amendment of that existing act?
Thank you. I mean, absolutely looked at everything. looked at the current legal framework, looked into the number of prosecutions and convictions under the RRA. I would just return to the point that, it's possible, of course it's possible to amend the RRA to increase the punishment, but it doesn't fundamentally change that offence. It's still a strict liability offence. To deter something as serious as ecocide from occurring, we have to get into the space of criminal law and have those much stronger penalties. And I think it's only right and fair that if you're proposing to take someone's liberty away for up to 20 years and all the other measures in the bill around punishment, that there has to be that higher bar, and that's where the mens rea test comes in. We have to prove it wasn't just a guilty act, which you can do under RRA strict liability, that there's a guilty mind as well. So that point about intent. In terms of enforcement, I will always support measures to boost enforcement powers. When I was a young planner back in 2001, the planning enforcement officers were the people who kind of moaned the loudest that they felt they were like the bottom of the food chain in the planning system, and they probably still feel that way. And I think in this committee we have scrutinised over the years resourcing for SEPA, resourcing for Nature Scot. We know that our local authorities are feeling pretty hollowed out and being able to do the bare minimum around their statutory functions. They feel the pressure. So I'm very sympathetic to all these arguments. But even if we fully resourced all these regulatory bodies around their current responsibilities, that doesn't give us the equivalent to an ecocide law. And I hope the member understands the point that I'm making there.
Kevin, there are some follow-up questions here on this particular. I'm going to move to Mark first, and then I've got one, and I'm looking to see if any other committee member does.
I mean, I guess what I'm picking up is that there is a consensus now on a permitting defence, and that would extend potentially to consenting bodies as well. So everybody's kind of covered by that, right? Okay. But I'm just wondering whether, even within that regime, ecocide can still occur. So I'm aware that under the habitats regulations that are designed to protect species and habitats, there is a provision of overriding public interest. So a consenting body can effectively allow environmental damage to occur if it's seen to be in the wider public interest. So that could be because of climate change or some other issue. I'm just wondering if that is something that you've considered, because if we're now looking at creating a defence effectively on consenting bodies, you might be in a situation where a consenting body does intentionally, willfully allow environmental damage because it's within the wider public interest to do that. So I'm just interested in that. I mean, it feels like the considered grounds shifted a little bit with the bill, which I think is good. Through the evidence that we've had on the impact on consenting bodies and those that have been granted permits. But I'm just wondering now, kind of within that space, whether that's something that's been considered or needs to be considered. And I hope that's clear. It's probably not.
Yeah, no, I understand the points that Mr Ruskell is making. I suppose it's an opportunity for me to also be clear that when we're talking about trying to protect Scotland's natural environment, I'm not saying that having ecocide law is the silver bullet and will be the answer to absolutely everything. I hope I've been really clear in the policy memorandum that, an ecocide offence is something that is extremely rare, and that is sort of between 1 in 10 and 20 years. For other lower level offences, which could still be, very significant, but we have existing regulations, including the Environmental Liability Scotland regulations of 2009, and that covers significant adverse effects to protected species and natural habitats. So, we've got a number of tools in the toolbox already. You know, I think today, you know, we can see the direction of travel on some of these stage 2 amendments, and I hope I've shown that willingness to work with the government and colleagues. But I suppose the point I would just want to really leave with colleagues today is having ecocide law sitting at the top of that regulatory pyramid, which would bring us into alignment with the EU and many other countries. You know, it's like ecocide law is now out of the box, and it's just a matter of time as to when all these other countries will get around to doing it. And I think you can see momentum working towards the international crime of ecocides, which is not a matter for us in this room to decide, but you can see the wider global context. I think it's important that those working in the regulatory space have certainty. And I think just a point which is not really addressing your question, Mark, but you know, there's been rightly questions about, does this provide uncertainty to those who are trying to, you know, build houses, build Scotland's infrastructure, make a profit in the course of that, which is perfectly legitimate to do. We're not going after legitimate businesses with, you know, the right permits in place. But I've also heard in the consultation and all the engagement that I've done with many stakeholders, to go back to, I suppose, the convener's original question, that this is not anti-business, this is pro-responsibility, and there are already businesses in Scotland who perhaps are not saying they're impacted by ecocide, but they are impacted when a minority of businesses and others don't do the right thing. And that includes those criminal gangs that we know are, you know, looking at business activities that do impact on the environment, and again, they feel it's low risk because the penalties, the punishment just isn't there. I think, you know, the recent example in England, again, I'm not saying this is ecocide, but, you know, basically a whole town becoming a dumping ground because people are going about, you know, collecting waste, charging for it, and then dumping it on a site. What is the environmental impact of that? I don't know, but people start to question, why can something like that happen in plain sight, but under the current legislation in England, the maximum criminal sentence would be 5 years in prison.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, I suppose to go back to my original question then, I mean, I think part of the argument you're making for ecocide is it forces us to then look from the top of that pyramid down at the regulatory framework. So I suppose there are questions that emerge. If you put in a permitting defence, does that mean you're totally okay with everything else that's in that regulatory framework that protects the environment that sits underneath that? Because you're kind of giving, if we do accept a permitting defence, there's a lot of ifs there, if we get stage 2, if we accept a permitting defence, we then are effectively creating a protection for regulators, consenting bodies and those that have permits. So it then invites the question, well, are we okay with that? Do we see any potential incidents of ecocide happening within the current permitted regime? And I think what I'm getting from your answer is that the current regime is fine, but there's still the issue at the top about culpability and intention, which isn't really captured by the strict liability offence at its highest level at the moment. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think just the final word on that is, you know, my policy aim is to prevent, you know, severe environmental destruction. That's what bringing in an offence of ecocide is about under criminal law. You know, if this law is passed and it opens up a wider conversation about all the other regulations that we have, and is there anything that we need to, because obviously if we're keeping pace with the EU, there might be other things that have to change anyway. So if this encourages Scottish Government and others to look afresh at existing regulations, their scope, how they operate, resourcing, that can only be a good thing. If we weren't talking about ecocide law, perhaps there wouldn't be the same attention and all of that. So I really do thank all of you for your questions, because I think it's actually put some things into the mind of government and others that actually, do we have all the right enforcement powers in place? I think some of the questions that have been asked about, particularly in the marine environment, some of the sort of cross-border issues. So, you know, it's very it's very much a very topical, ongoing discussion. I know that there are conversations happening, you know, in Westminster too around ecocide law. So things are moving pretty quickly. But if it means that we get a bit sharper and look at everything from planning to all the different regulations that you've mentioned, that can only be a good thing.
Okay, thank you.
Douglas, did you have a question on this subject?
Yes, I've got a follow-up from Kevin Stewart's question.
Surely.
And we've had a couple of examples from local authorities when, you know, they've suggested that this bill may actually cause a couple of problems. Moray Council, for example, have said MPF4 allows excavation of deep peat for renewable energy developments, an action that would otherwise possibly fall within the definition of ecocide. So I guess, would MPF4 be a defence for them to allow that to take place or not?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question, Douglas?
Yeah, so Moray Council
on the
said,
point of peat, just so that
yeah, so
I'm clear.
Moray Council have said MPF4 allows excavation of deep peat for renewable energy developments, an action that would otherwise possibly fall within the definition of ecocide. So they're worried now that if they were allowing this peat excavation to take place, you know, would they potentially be liable for ecocide?
So I think at any point in time, a planning authority will make decisions based on the current legislation, the current policy of the Scottish Government, and then look at local circumstances. They'll do that. They'll be informed by, you know, environmental impact assessments. They'll have specialists reports that the developer, if it's a private developer, will have to provide support and documentations that will be looked at independently by the planning authority. So there's a very robust regime for that already. If the government's policy position on peat extraction changed, then how the planners operate would also have to change. So I think it's absolutely right and proper that any planning authority, including Moray Council, would look at NPF4 and all other relevant legislation, strategies and policies and guidance. But if this is a legitimate business with a planning application that's looked at and it gets a consent, then, you know, if there was any concern about how that had been operated, if it has given rise to, you know, environmental harm, that would be looked at initially under RRA. If it's something like ecocide level, as I've said, we're looking towards an amendment at stage 2. But again, if it's something that's just so reckless and intentional that, you know, there was real intent that, you know, we're going to cause ecocide here and no one tried to stop it. But I think that's so far away from what you're describing, Douglas.
And so it's another example from Highland Council. They're describing an underground cable from Bewley and Cool Links Golf Course. Could be viewed as reckless if the development was granted against advice relating to environmental harm. So I guess in this instance, there could have been an environmental NGO who put an objection in. So, you know, it's all about risk, I guess, for these planning authorities. And does it make it too risky for them with this bill in place to actually grant permission to some of these projects?
No, I don't think it does. I don't think it changes the assessment of environmental, economic, social impacts. I think we have very well-established processes that assess all the different considerations around the land use planning system. The example about an underground cable in the Highlands, I'm not sure what the environmental damage is that they're perhaps hinting at. So again, if there was a particular case, you would have to look and see, well, what is the harm that's been caused, and what is the nature of that? What is the gravity of that? What, you know, is it widespread? Is it long-term harm? You're saying if an environmental NGO, so do you mean like a statutory consultee who's given a response to the planning authority?
No, it could just be anyone that's writing in and then basically saying, oh, this could potentially be an ecocide event if you were to grant this permission. I'm just trying to think whether then that plants the seed of doubt into the planning authority's mind. I mean, they might think, oh, hold on, this is a bit too risky. We're gonna not grant it because it might be seen as an ecocide event in years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've got members of the public or other interested parties responding to every planning application saying this is ecocide, I don't think that's going to be taken seriously. I mean, again, this is about proportionality. I mean, I think we have a very robust, well-established tradition in Scotland. We have a planning system that works, and it's very clear in legislation who are the statutory consultees that are trusted voices and experts. So, whether that's SEPA or Nature Scot or Transport Scotland, you know the list. And importantly, that does include community councils, because community voice is important. But if someone writes to a planning authority advising don't do this because it's going to cause ecocide, again, I think that has to be evidenced in some way. So, again, if it's about statutory consultees, which I think you're saying that this particular authority mentioned, and that was dismissed, again, that there are checks and balances in the system to ensure that, if something has been raised as potentially very serious, a very serious departure from advice, that could potentially be notified to ministers or called in. So there's well-established processes, but what you've described from those letters is fairly routine, albeit major, but fairly routine planning applications that planning authorities look at every single day and have to weigh up all these considerations, always based on the best available evidence.
Okay, thanks. Kevin, I was going to go on to my next point.
No, I'm going to ask a question, if I may, and then bring you in on your next point. Just, Monica, so I understand it, that what I've just heard from two members is questioning you on concerns on the consenting aspect of it. So there's ways of allaying people's concerns, because those concerns come from obviously outside the committee, and that is for amendments to be laid either by the government or by you or by individual members to get round it. What I'm not sure I've heard from you, Monica, is I might have got this wrong, did you say you weren't going to lay amendments and it was up to other people to lay amendments, or will you be laying amendments in light of what you've heard this morning from committee members, which come from outside the committee?
Mm-hmm. No, just to clarify, I'm saying I understand it's open to any member to bring forward amendments. So there could be members who are not here today who would also have amendments. So I suppose my general point to that is I will act in good faith with all of them. I think I've been clear the areas that the government is seeking to amend, which is including the permit defence, re-examining the reverse burden of proof, amending the reporting obligation, which we've not talked about today, but I'm absolutely fine with what government say on that, and adding an explicit alternative conviction provision. That's all fine. I hope I have been clear in response to questions from members, including from Kevin Stewart. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I will reserve my position to see the report, because I obviously can't prejudge what will be in your report. But if the committee makes recommendations on amendments or is still seeking clarity at that point, then of course I will look at that. And as the member, it's very much in my interest to, I suppose, try and be in the driving seat as much as possible. So, like I did with my previous member's bill, absolutely would probably be thinking about amendments. So I'm not trying to outsource that to others. But again,
I'm just really wondering, Monica, if you've been swayed by the arguments you've heard this morning from members around the table about concerns regarding the consent process. Are you concerned? Are you swayed by their views?
You know, I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic. I mean, I've read the responses from individual planning authorities, and many are not identical, but very similar. So I know that Heads of Planning Scotland met, COSLA's responded. There's a number of responses that, you know, kind of echo each other. And it's the planning community is a small community. So I'm not making light of that at all, because I know that when you are working in a planning authority, you're under a lot of scrutiny. It can be a really thankless job, and particularly if it's a development that attracts a lot of objection, a lot of community response, and there's sometimes pressure from you know, developers. Most developers, the vast majority, behave impeccably. But I know of examples of planning officers and other officials being bullied and intimidated. It does go on. I've discussed that with Unison as well. That's why that discussion about protection for workers and people really in the front line, you know, those points are not lost on me. I hope I've been clear around the point about the permit defence. I will take away the comments that have been made by colleagues today and just reflect on that to see if there is something that needs to be done just to provide that, I suppose, comfort that perhaps people in the planning world are looking for, and others in that regulatory space. But hopefully what I have been clear on is the policy aims and the intention. I think already we're seeing with the amendments that the government have mapped out in discussion with me and with the committee, the areas where I think clarity and comfort can be given. But as I said to Mr Stewart, you know, I'm very confident that we can use the time we have in Parliament wisely and efficiently to make sure that my door is open to listen to colleagues and work with everyone. And there will be further opportunities for other MSPs to drop in and have a chat with me as well about it.
Okay, now I'm going to bring in Kevin Stewart. Can I just say before we do it, I'm in the, I always feel I'm in the hot seat here when we get short of time, and I'm just saying that the clock never stops. So short answers, short questions will help me, but I don't want to stifle debate, especially on a member's bill that's raised by a member of this committee. But I'm just saying the position I'm in. Kevin.
Thank you, Convener, and I welcome what Ms Lennon has said about her door being open for those that are likely to lodge amendments. My problem is that as we have gone on with this, there have been other cans of worms opened, and we've heard from the planning authorities. You know, I've been listening of late to elected members and councils who have just cottoned onto this, and it's fine for us to be able to put forward amendments, but we've not really, you cannot listen to all of them and their concerns in the time available, I think. And this is one of the things which concerns me to a huge degree, because I think there was dubiety about how planners would see this from some members. We've shown that that's the case. But again, now hearing from elected members saying, I don't know if I would vote for that, just in case. And, you know, I think all of that has to be taken into consideration if we are going to get this legislation absolutely right. And I come back to my point around about the level of unintended consequences that I think there still may be here, and that we need to explore further.
So I'll just remind the committee that the consultation on the Members' Bill started in November of 2023. It ran for 14 weeks. Some of these questions and issues that you're raising, Mr Stewart, are not new. Perhaps some of the people saying it now because the committee proactively wrote out to the planning authorities and asked them to respond. So we're perhaps hearing it presented in a very concentrated way. But these questions are not new, and they're not unique questions to Scotland. You know, I could also point you to elected members and planning professionals and other scientists at SEPA who strongly welcome this and agree with it. And just to remind the committee, the planning authorities are saying that they support the general principles. So I think that they're not new issues. I know that Glasgow City Council did respond over the summer to your call for views. I see that COSLA are sort of taking a fairly neutral, you know, we'll look at this down the line if we need to. So, you know, my door is open to speak to COSLA, to Heads of Planning Scotland, obviously to yourself, Kevin, and I might even put the kettle on. So there's plenty of time to do all of that. And you know, I think there was a mention of the Royal Town Planning Institute of Scotland as a former member, not currently, but, you know, happy to chat. But I think we are, just to finish on response to that, I mean, we've also seen, you know, quite compelling and clear support from many other organisations that this bill would do what it says on the tin, and that's about trying to protect Scotland from severe environmental destruction that is carried out in a intentional or reckless manner, with very strong penalties. It sends a very strong signal to anyone who thinks that they could get away with a crime of that nature. And hopefully what it does do is strengthen people's understanding of the Regulatory Reform Act Scotland as well.
I think I've not come across anyone at all who is against the general principles of the bill. But I think that there is a real fear out there about unintended consequences as it stands at the moment. And I do believe that some folk out there want the ability to have the time to feed in their concerns so that we get any amendments right. My real concern about all of this now is that this is very late in the day in a parliamentary term, and I don't know if we're going to give those folks who have concerns the justice in terms of the time required. And I get your point, Ms Lennon, about the 14-week consultations from November 23, but you know as well as I do that you know, sometimes folk didn't come forward at initial consultations because they don't see how it's going to impact them. Just like I don't think the planners realised how much this would possibly impact them until they got the letter. Thank you, Convener.
Yeah, Monica, I mean, I'm sure you want to respond briefly to that, but...
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question was, but I think I have to push back a little bit because I feel there's a number of assertions in there. The parliamentary timetable is not a matter for me, and you know we're in the hands of the Parliament. But you know, if people have a mind that's closed to this and want to believe that we don't have time and want to try and wreck the bill, that's a matter that's not in my control. I think we have to be careful when we say things like there's a lot of fear out there. I just don't see that. I don't think the evidence shows that. I won't repeat all the numbers, but you know, huge public support for the bill. We've seen that in the consultation. You know, a huge number of organisations from all parts of civil society, including business, supporting the bill. It's very clear that this adds something different to the RRA. And okay, we've had, you know, a batch of responses from the planning authorities who very politely responded to your request. And I think, you know, it's clear there's been some collaboration and discussion. And I think at the root of that, there is a bit of misunderstanding. I think it's on us as elected members, you know, if people are saying they're frightened and they're scared and there's unintended consequences, I think we all have a responsibility to bring them back to the facts of the bill. I'll take that away because I have been speaking to elected members from different political parties who are very enthusiastic about this and feel it would very much help them in terms of helping to protect their communities from ecocide. I know a number of local authorities were looking at possible motions. It's not really for me to go out and mobilise a campaign to do that. I'm just trying to, in a very calm, considered way, take the Parliament through the rationale of the bill, being quite clear about what the bill covers and what it doesn't. You know, there are people out there who are saying to me, is this a way to stop X, Y, Z sectors? And I'm very clearly pushing back against that and saying no. You know, I absolutely agree that if a business or an operator has obtained a licence and a permit and they're acting within the law, they should be left alone to go on and do that. And the regulators should be allowed to regulate that in confidence. If there's new planning applications come in a post-ecocide law world, then the same tools, assessments will be available to planning authorities and judgments will be made. And I think if it helps to improve transparency about why decisions were taken, why an issue was settled on, that yes, there might be some environmental impact, but here's how it can be mitigated, or here's why a decision's been taken, that is nothing new. So I really don't accept that there is widespread fear in Scotland or in planning authorities about the process of an ecocide bill, and I reinforce the fact that there is significant public support for this. It is on me at a stage 2 process to make sure that we have, you know, amendments that address those concerns if there's evidence to show that. And I've said I'll work with the government and members to do that. And of course, we'll be an active participant, convener. I won't just sit back and leave others to do the work. Believe me, I've worked very hard on this concept from 2021. It does take time. I don't know if, Mr Trout, if you've done a member's bill, but it does take time. I don't have the whole of the civil service behind me, but I am working with the government. And I think that's an important point. Working constructively with the government. More than 50 MSPs signed the final proposal. The government didn't intervene to say, we're going to amend RRA, we're going to give effect to this. They have allowed me to advance, and there is that shared aspiration to keep pace with the EU on this, because, you know, looking around us and our near neighbours, we don't want Scotland to be left behind. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Douglas, I think you've got a question now.
Monica, you're proposing maximum penalty of 20 years imprisonment. Why did you settle on that figure and not like 10 years like they have in France, or obviously the minimum of 8 in the EU Environmental Crime Directive?
Thank you. Again, the principal aim is really having that deterrent effect, and, you know, up to 20 years in prison. I mean, it is a very serious punishment. So to try and have that maximum deterrent effect, you know, it had to go beyond what we have currently in terms of up to 5 years with the RRA. And we're seeing some of the examples in the European Union. I think Belgium, for example, where it's, I'm going to get this wrong, is it 15 years? Sorry, it's getting late in the session. But again, it's to set the bar really, really high.
And so, you know, why did you rule out 8 or 10, or was it just a case of you wanted to make it as high as possible to try and make that deterrent as big as possible?
You know, obviously, listen to what stakeholders were saying. The Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, who have given evidence at stage 1, said that the maximum term is also aligned with the evolving criminalisation of ecocide in other jurisdictions, where it carries imprisonment of up to 10 to 20 years. So examples, again, come back to the Belgian penal codes and the French climate and resilience law. In the consultation, you know, asked the question about imprisonment to see if people felt that was about right, or did they want something different. You know, 2,600 people said that they supported that. That was like 79% of respondents. Fully supportive, 14% were partially supportive. Really, it's to reflect the seriousness of the crime. And I'm trying to think, yeah, I've got a wee list here. I mentioned ERCS, but Unison Scotland, Scottish Environment Link, fully supported the proposed penalty in principle, stating it was proportionate to the harm caused and was aligned with other approaches in other jurisdictions. So I suppose in doing this, I didn't want it to look like Scotland was being a bit like, you know, I don't want us to look like a soft touch on this. If we're going to have ecocide law, I want us to do it properly.
Okay, thanks, Monica. Thanks.
Thanks, Douglas. Sarah, you've got some questions now, followed by Mark.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, I want to follow up the issue about EU alignment and discuss the issue of penalties. And we had quite a lot of evidence from witnesses with a range of different views about the exact detail of potential penalties. Some witnesses said, and the reviews submitted to us, that the bill should go further in some areas in relation to penalties, looking at what's been discussed in the Environmental Crime Directive and also looking at penalties which go beyond traditional types of penalties. And there were some issues being considered in there. So looking at restricting a company's operations, turnover-based fines, remediation orders. And if you just pick up the remediation orders, that was one issue discussed by witnesses. So I'm keen to get your views. Do you think, having listened or seen in writing the evidence given from different witnesses, do you think there's a case for expanding any of the penalty provisions that are set out in the bill at the moment?
Thank you for the question. I think, you know, aligning with the EU Crime Directive, that's been one of the policy aims, was trying to make sure that in a Scottish setting that we have the right penalties and the right punishments in place. You know, I think, as well as the custodial sentence, you know, as unlimited fines, the bill has the provisions on compensation, on publicity orders. I think on your specific point, I might just turn to Ros for that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in relation to remediation orders, there's already provision in the bill in relation to the fine levels and the extent that money can be taken back, and also compensation orders, which could be used in terms of paying for restoration. I think one of the thoughts about remediation is that the nature of an ecocide event might be that the damage can't be entirely undone, and so actually it wouldn't necessarily be possible to have a full remediation. And yet, just as the members said, during the drafting process, there was a real focus on the collective impact of all the different things within this bill, but also it combined with existing legislation. So it is already capacity, for example, to seize assets from organisations under other legislation. So this combines with existing legislation.
So basically, you don't think there's a need to explicitly reference remediation because potentially that could be delivered through other elements in the bill, just to get that on the record? If it was appropriate and possible.
Yeah. So far, it's not something that I felt is necessary to stay in the bill. I think just reinforcing Ros Thompson's answer, you know, we know that there's other provisions already around proceeds of crime, and I suppose, you know, the compensation element of the bill, which is really, you know, where what can be done in terms of any sort of clean-up, for example, then again, that's another way to make sure that, you know, the polluter pays, the perpetrator pays, so that the burden financially doesn't fall onto communities, local authorities or others. But I can take that away to see if, you know, does that leave a gap in terms of remediation? But I don't think that it does, but if Sarah Boyack has further questions on that, I can take that one away and take some advice on that.
No, really, it's just that one of the witnesses said it was a curiosity that it wasn't explicitly included in the bill. So I think it's that issue about explanation about the options that come from the current legal issues that are referenced in the bill.
I'm just trying to remember what SEPA had said, so I'm just helpfully looking now. So there are already civil remedies available to SEPA to drive restoration, and as we've heard, there's existing environmental legislation that covers restoration. Given the gravity of ecocide, didn't include them in the bill, and the focus instead is on compensation. And we believe that that can include the costs of remediation. And I think just to, you know, repeat the point that Ros has made, given the scale of ecocides, particularly if the damage caused is irreversible, then remediation might not be an option. So it's not been made explicit in the bill, but it's certainly my understanding that under the compensation provision, it would be covered there. But again, I can just absolutely take that away and just double check our thinking around that.
Depend on different cases where legal proceedings were being brought, what would be appropriate at the time, but it's not excluded. even though it's not explicitly referenced on the face of the bill. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes, I think that's my understanding, but I think I'll just bring in Ailey on the legal point, if that's okay, because it is very much case by case.
It was just to say that Section 7 is explicit that the compensation orders can include the costs of remediation. It was, I think it was felt that given the severe nature of ecocide, the cost should be reclaimable by those that are responsible kind of for the clean-up or have suffered the damage caused, and that could be anyone. It could be SEPA, it could be a local authority, it could be individuals, but that it would be them doing that remediation as opposed to the perpetrator or the accused, given the serious nature of the offence.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, especially if they're in prison by then.
Michael, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I'm just seeking clarification on reference to the Proceeds of Crime Act, because I remember serving in the committee, if I recall correctly, that dealt with that act that deals with pursuing assets that have been obtained through illegal activity, rather than criminal offences being committed and then claiming some form of remediation from them. I'm just trying to clarify, how would that work in this instance? In relation to this bill? So, you know, the proceeds of crime, the Crown Office, they would go and secure an order of confiscation sort of idea. It's then for that individual to demonstrate that they didn't achieve it through illegal. I don't understand how that would apply in this instance. Can you just help me to understand that?
Well, again, it's going to depend on individual cases, but, you know, if it was at all relevant and it's highly possible that it's not, then that would be a matter for the discretion of the courts on application by the Crown Office. So...
You don't need a criminal conviction for a proceeds of crime matter. You know, they can go to the Crown Office can go to the court and they can actually say this person's actually got so much wealth that we actually believe it's on the basis of they've got it through criminal activity, and seek a confiscation order, and then you've got to prove that that's not how they've achieved it. Yeah. I'm just trying to understand how that would interface with this bill.
Yeah, so I'll turn to Ailey for that, but just, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is there's existing powers under Proceeds of Crime Act 2002 for the police and other law enforcement agencies to investigate, search and seize assets obtained by criminal activity. There had been a question about why, not a question today, but there had been a question about why that wasn't in the bill, and it's because, well, that power exists already, and that's a matter to be left to the discretion of the courts on a relevant application by the Crown Office. Ailey, have I got that wrong?
No, I think that's why it came up, was in response to concerns, looking at the kind of other options in the European Environmental Crime Directive, where in terms of what happens with the proceeds from the crime of ecocide, that's where this would kick in. If we're talking about the proceeds of the crime of ecocide, there's no need to further legislate in terms of proceeds of crime.
Yeah, well, I think I sort of understand. I'm not entirely sure that the Proceeds of Crime Act is actually the legislation that you would refer to here in this anyway. Anyway, okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I want to move on to the financial memorandum in terms of how you actually implement this bill, because we got concerns raised by SEPA that what is in the environment, it's in the financial memorandum underestimates the actual costs of implementing this bill. And you know, Nature Scott also mentioned that they don't think that as it stands, the extension enforcement powers applies to it. So they'd need to work with SEPA. So there's a few questions about actual detailed implementation issues. So just wondering if you have thought this through in terms of the implementation of this bill, costs, how it would actually be done by those public sector organisations that would be required to implement it.
Thank you. So yeah, careful consideration has been given to all of these matters. So the bill includes provisions to ensure that SEPA's existing investigative powers can be used under this bill, and anticipate that SEPA will use existing processes and procedures to investigate any reported cases of ecocide, including liaison with COPFS. That was the basis for the methodology in the financial memorandum. While SEPA may be required to dedicate significant resource to the investigation of any reported incidents of ecocide, if the bill is enacted, any such offence would previously have been looked into as an offence under the existing environmental legislation, including Section 40 RRA. So, as a result, I felt it's not anticipated that SEPA would incur additional notable costs on an ongoing basis as a result of the introduction of the bill's enforcement provisions. Having said that, though, I do acknowledge the point SEPA has made in evidence, and they said that the scale of such events will require significant effort, resource, training and support. Scale, resource implications and training requirements should also reflect the breadth of reporting agencies that could be involved. So on that, and they're emphasising scale here again, let's think about the scale of ecocide. So on that basis, I do acknowledge that SEPA's costs could be higher than those set out in the financial memorandum. So I absolutely take that point.
Okay, and the other comment I made there was about a Nature Scot. So they have questions about funding, and local authorities also raise concerns that they would not be likely to have the resources to engage in an ecocide investigation. So can you just clarify or explain how the expansion of powers in Section 9 relates to existing regulatory remits of public bodies, and what do you think, as the members leading on this bill, which bodies would be expected to lead on an ecocide investigation?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and I've read some of the comments from COSLA and again some of the planning authorities about resources. So, you know, anticipate that while local authorities would need to be informed and made aware of any ecocide offences that could impact on their locality, it's not anticipated that this bill will generate any additional financial obligations. Councils can quite often be the first body that hear about environmental offences. People maybe lift the phone or email the local council, but the council has to report serious cases to SEPA. You know, and it's SEPA who are going to be the primary enforcement body or investigatory body on this. So I would say, I mean, I'm always sympathetic to local authorities about their financial settlement and the capacity for them to do the jobs that they want to do. But I would say that if there is a severe environmental incident that occurs under the existing regulations, that has to be dealt with by, you know, our public sector, these regulatory bodies. I think once we get into the financial memorandum and you're in the business, it looks like, yeah, we are looking at a serious that's most likely of ecocide level, then there could be other costs that kick in. But there's also been other adjustments in the financial memorandum to take out reporting costs. I don't know, Roz, on the financial memorandum, is there anything particular around local authorities or SEPA that I've not mentioned there?
Just that the focus for SEPA, another organisation that we looked at obviously would be the role of the police, but there is an existing unit at Gartcosh, as I understand it, where the SEPA and the police work quite closely together. So we took sort of existing practices into account whilst acknowledging the point about scale of an ecocide event.
Just to flag with you the fact that SEPA had raised concerns about the financial memorandum not actually covering what they think the cost would be for them for actually proceeding with an inquiry?
Yeah. No, I mean, I've acknowledged the points that SEPA have made. And again, when you're trying to put together the financial memorandum, you know, it's just trying to, you know, with the best available information and evidence at the time. I think any rise in costs, I think, would be minimal. I think overall, the envelope of the financial memorandum, you know, I don't want to say it's a cheap bill, but it's not an expensive bill compared to many others. So again, interested to hear what the committee will say in your report about that. But I think just to reinforce that point that we have these very well established systems in place already, where you have highly expert CPIT officials embedded in the Police Scotland Crime Campus at Gartcosh, which I think I maybe learned that from Michael Matheson a few months back. I said to him, "Do you think I could get in to visit?" And he said no, because I think
I don't think they would, but
but I think it shows the seriousness of the investigations that they do, and bearing in mind that not everyone that they investigate is a legitimate business person. There's lots of nasty people out there as well. So I think it's important they remain faceless and we don't name any of those officers. But we have these systems in place already. Is there a question about resources? I think there always is. But I think if we just remember that in the bill we're setting out ecocide, very rare. Could it happen maybe once every 10 to 20 years?
Okay, thank you. Back to convener.
Oh, thank you. I hoped you were going to say that. The last question now is going to come from Mark Ruskell, because if we weren't up against the clock before we are now. So, Mark, I would encourage a short question and Monica a short answer, if I may.
Thank you.
Please.
So there's two views on reporting. Scottish Government would like the reporting requirements removed from the bill, but you've also had some alternative views on reporting. I think some stakeholders would like to see a kind of incident level reporting provision, so that if there is an ecocide offence committed and there's a conviction, that there's a kind of reporting after the incident. I just wondered what your views were on both of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've pretty much said, I'll agree with the government on this one. I'll keep it short, so I won't go over all the background to this in terms of the Environmental Crime Directive, where again I was trying to give a mirror. But I do appreciate if there hasn't been an ecocide event, then the requirement to produce a report would be burdensome. Again, it's a potential to save some money. I can't remember the exact amount, but something like £50,000. So amenable to removing this at stage 2 if we get there. I think if the committee says in the report that there's merit in a report following an ecocide event, then again, also happy to look at that. And again, it might be something the government is amenable to, but again, I'm not, I don't have a strong position on it either way. I would be guided by recommendations and work with the government on it too.
I guess it would depend on the event, wouldn't it? So if it was a public inquiry into a major catastrophic event, then that might follow anyway. But yeah, there's food for thought. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Before we move into private session, convener, I'd like a point of clarification, please, because I've had a look at standing orders, chapter 12, which look at committee procedures. You said earlier on that politics should be left at the door of the committee room, which I thought was rather a strange phrase in a parliament, including in a parliamentary committee. There's nothing in those standing orders, chapter 12 of committee procedures, that says that's the case. So could you reflect, please, on what you said earlier in your decision to close me down for asking what I think was a relevant question?
Of course, Mr. Chair, and I will reflect on it. And what I'll do is, in the reasonable and responsible way I think that I have tried to convene committee meetings for 9 years, I'll look back at the official record. I'll check exactly what you said. I'll check exactly what I've said. I'll then reflect on what I've said and whether it's correct. And I'll come back to the committee on that. I don't have the benefit of checking standing orders during a committee meeting, but please be assured that I always try and convene this committee in a way that I think is reasonable. So give me the chance to reflect on what I said, a chance to reflect on what you said, a chance to speak to the clerks and reflecting on standing orders. And I will, of course, come back, and I'd be delighted to do so, Mr. Chair. I hope you'll accept that comment. Thank you. And did you say that was a point of order?
I said it was a point of clarification.
Point of clarification.
You can't have
good,
points
of
of order
course,
at
because
committee, because I read the standing orders, which I'm very prone to do.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and I will come back to you. And it won't be in the, it will be in the fullness of time, but it will be before we break up from recess, because I can't do it on the. Can I just say to Monica Lennon, thank you very much for giving evidence to us this morning. I think by my calculations, unless I'm going to be corrected, you sat there for 2 hours and 12 minutes giving evidence on your bill. Quite a marathon for anyone to come in front of the committee, let alone a committee which you normally sit on. So, well, Monica, you could have had coffee. You're always welcome to drink coffee. Thank you very much. And we'll now go into closed session to reflect on the evidence. And I think we'll see you in the latter part of the closed session once we've considered the evidence on the Ecocide bill. So thank you very much.